This is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed as items 1 and 3 on today's agenda. For the items just mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today. Can I ask for some silence, please, some quiet? For the items just mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 150 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 210 days for an official plan amendment. And as you know, a comment sheet is available at the door for anyone wishing to submit written comments on these amendments. So today is a really important day at Planning Committee because of for many reasons, but in particular the development charge bylaw. So if anybody has any motions right now with regard that you haven't already handed in, please hand them into Melody so she can share, our committee coordinator, so she can share with all of us and the staff, or on any other item. Are there any declarations of interest? None? Confirmation of minutes from April 25th, 2019. Carried? Okay. I'm on the wrong agenda again. Okay, the first item up is the zoning bylaw amendment for 2480 Walkley Road. Do we have any speakers? We have Sean-Marc Desjardins, if needed, and Caleb Blakely Novatech. Are you here? Hi, Doug. Okay, so if we don't need you to speak, you're content not speaking? Okay, so I did get an email from my staff saying that Councillor Dean's staff just came in to say that she may be a little late this morning, but she has no issues with item 1 on the agenda. Does anyone else have any questions? Is this item carried? Thank you very much for coming out. Okay, the second item up, for which we have simultaneous translation service, is development charges for 2019 development charges for 2720 Richmond Road. We have speakers, so we're holding this item. The next item up is the zoning bylaw amendment for 95 Kayenta, or is it Kayenta? Councillor Gower? Is it Kayenta, or you don't know? All right, let's make it. I think Kayenta. So this one is the zoning bylaw amendment for 95 Kayenta. It's in Stittsville, and it is basically a little clubhouse in an adult community. Does anyone have any questions on it? We have Melissa Cote from Tartan, and you only need to speak if necessary. Is it necessary that she speak, anyone? Any questions? No? Is this item carried? Thank you. Thank you. The next one we are holding for sure. That's Mr. Willis will be taking charge over that. And we have a lot of communication on it, and we do have speakers. Item number 5 is the status update. Planning Committee inquires and motions for the period ending April 23rd, 2019. I'm asking that you receive this. Anybody want to hold it? No? Received? Thank you. And then we have an IPD and information previously distributed on cash in lieu of parkland. Is that received? Thank you. We're not doing it at the end of the agenda. We're doing, sure, give it to me. Okay, just so you know, so you can think about it, everyone, and everyone that's in the audience, we do have a motion that we add an additional item to the agenda, which is the overview of Bill 108. And Mr. Willis is going to give us a presentation on this. We don't want to have it smushed in with what our core work is today with the development charge that we have to deal with today. So I want to, that's why I'm putting it on the table now, or else we would have waited, right? So is that item added? No problems, okay. Because it's not current, it's Bill 108, it's not active. He's going to give us, but there's a lot of interest in it, right? So we're going to keep the two separate, so after we deal with the development charges, then he will do that, and then questions. So please, I'm going to ask Mr. Willis to take on the authority of saying when we're asking questions, if any of us go into the 108, which is easy to do because it's kind of like confusing, or, you know, maybe a crossover or whatever, that he will say, I'll deal with that when we deal with the 108. Okay? Does everybody agree? All right. Thank you. So, go back to the first held item, which is development charges 2720 Richmond Road. As I said, we have simultaneous translation available for that. And our first, let's move the motion, Vice Chair Tierney. Vice Chair Tierney has a motion, it's replacement of a table.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. I've asked clerk staff to circulate the table because it is a table and it's very hard to read. So be it resolved that the table on page 6 be replaced with the following. Hopefully everyone's received a copy of that table.
Okay. Is that carried? Carried?
Madam Chair, it might help if I just gave a 5-second comment on what the table is.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, so while the total that staff agrees should be refunded in respect to the educational development charges is in the recommendation, the amounts to the individual school boards was inadvertently left out of table 6, the table on page 6. You now have the individual numbers.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Mark? No? All right, so our first delegation coming forward is Mr. Paul Weber. This is certainly not your first trip here, Mr. Weber? Yeah. No, I'm just asking for Mr. Weber at this point, unless you want everyone up here at once. I'll call you folks next.
Yeah, I think Pierre and Pierre Tetro can follow. I'm going to take my 5 minutes and sort of speak to the legal issue, and they'll tell you a little more about the board activity.
And who are you?
I'm Charlotte Watson. I work with Mr. Weber.
This is the new Mr. Weber after June 30th. So if you need political contributions,
Your hair looks great, Paul.
Right? If you need political contributions, her address is still 116 Lisgar. Okay, the Development Charges Act provides for mandatory exemptions from DCs and optional exemptions, and I'm assuming later today you're going to be dealing with many of the optional exemptions. Section 3 provides that an exemption from taxation in the Assessment Act is not a mandatory exemption, except land owned by and used for the purposes of a municipality or a board defined in the Education Act. CEPEO is such a board. It's the owner of Grant School. I'm told construction is 50% along, and there'll be students in there in January. And it's used for the purposes of the board because I've given you the section of the Act that deals with powers of the board. It is a power of the board to allow the use of a school for any educational or other lawful purpose. Now, one of those purposes is to further development of related community hubs. That's a lawful purpose. As of March 2015, it became the policy of the province to encourage such uses. The Ministry of Education specifically supports that provincial commitment and agrees to co-locate such hubs within schools where appropriate. Specifically, the Ministry of Education has approved the location of a hub at the former Grant School and fully funded it. The $8.7 million, I believe it is, that the ministry has ponied up includes that community hub. So there's some givens here. The province talks about every community hub is different because it depends on the community it's in, what community it's serving. CEPEO has only 16,000 students, about 3,000 staff, and it covers all of eastern Ontario, as far east as Trenton and as far north as Pembroke. It's a very dispersed board. It is, of course, Francophone and serves the particular needs of the Francophones within that very large overall area. It's just over 40,000 square kilometers. There is no provincial agreement that allows municipalities to dip into Ministry of Education funding to fatten up the development charge reserve funds. There are needs in the Francophone community for language-specific facilities, and others will speak to that. And of course, there are some shrunken resources in terms of the province, and you'll be talking about Bill 108 later. This is not a case that council can win. It can't win in the public domain, it can't win in the provincial domain, and while there are arguable points, I don't think it can even win in the narrowly legal domain if it's taken to LPAT. My co-presenters, as I say, will describe the needs of the CEPEO and the Francophone community. Each hub is as unique as the community it serves, and that is a unique community. Dipping into educational funding has been refused many times, including the La Cité case. I acted for the municipalities where they tried to extract development charges from La Cité, and the courts ripped us apart, saying, no, just because you apply for a building permit doesn't mean you have to pay every charge the municipality can come up with. We've had preliminary inquiries of other jurisdictions. I've looked specifically at Durham, where the bylaw is existing, and Hamilton, where there's a new bylaw under consideration. And York and Toronto have also confirmed informally that comparable municipalities are not taking the Ottawa staff position. They believe these community hubs in schools, paid for by the ministry, are lawful within school purposes. One of the things when you get to consider your development charge bylaw today, and I won't speak to it specifically, the exemption in Ottawa is unique. It talks about school purpose. Everybody else's bylaw talks about school purposes, which is the language of the Act. And again, it may be something that should be cleaned up along the way, though I have no mandate for that. Why invite appeals to that? I looked for a study of what Ottawa had done to implement the provincial policy. As I say, it became provincial policy as long ago as March of 2015. Can't really find much, nor have I ever seen any study of the activities that are already occurring through the community in numerous schools. I mean, you'll be aware of the myriad of activities that goes on in your schools and your wards. I don't say it's frightening, but it's certainly never been studied or summarized that I can find. So I conclude by asking you to allow the appeal, order the repayment of all of the funds paid under protest, together with interest, and if I might have a copy of the new Table 6.
Sure. Can we get him a copy? Oh, he's got one.
I'd simply say to you that the coterminous boards have all waived their claims, so don't give
Can
any...
you repeat that, please?
Yeah, the coterminous boards have all waived their claims. Nobody is asking for money back at Ottawa Carleton Catholic, French Catholic, or Ottawa Carleton District. They just think you're wrong, and they don't want money back. They support the CEPEO and its appeal.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. Is it a question of Mr. Weber? Councillor Brockington, and then Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. Mr. Weber, thank you for your presentation. Can you just confirm which ministry provided the $8.95 million?
Ministry of Education.
It was? Okay, thank you. What is the purpose of a school board under law?
What is the purpose of a school board? Well, it's an interesting place to ask it because you're sitting in a school gymnasium. My mother graduated this school in 1937. I hate to be reminded of that. She then, after graduating, went to a little town called Glenburnie outside of Kingston, where she taught in a one-room, 8th grade school. Her primary duty was to light the fire in the morning. You know, so when you ask me what the lawful purpose of a school board is, it's everything. It is a community builder every bit as much as the council is, and as you will know from your time at OCDSB, there are thousands of programs running in our schools.
There are, and I don't have my copy of the Education Act here, but I think the Act specifies in a legal context what the purpose of a school board is. And I ask that question today because the staff report that we have before us lists the intended purposes of that renovated space. Employment and training programs, social services, legal and immigration services, childcare, health services, and more. Those are all well-intended purposes. No one's going to argue about the purposes of a community hub, particularly a Francophone community hub. I would argue that not all of those services that I just listed are mandated for a school board. I don't believe that's the case.
They're not mandated, but they're within the powers of the school board.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wrestling with is whether or not, because in your letter to, I believe it's the city, Mr. O'Connor, our city clerk, you're talking about no land except land owned by and used for the purposes of either a municipality or board can be exempt. And so what I'm trying to wrestle with is whether or not the intended purposes of this expanded space are whether or not are truly the mandate of a school board, because I think that's where the crux of a legal argument rests. If the space isn't going to be used for school board purposes, then why would we argue that they're exempt from development charges?
If they're not for school board purposes?
Correct.
Right. I'll leave that to my co-presenters because they were the people who were involved in the direct negotiation of this, and they can talk to the provincial point of view. But I will say, as of March 2015, it is provincial policy to look at community hubs wherever you can put them. It is the future. And this is a particular Francophone issue. You're covering 40,000 kilometers with only 16,000 students. How do you get French language services out there? This is the first initiative in the West End. There are 12 partners, if you can call them that, and Pierre will speak to that.
And perhaps after that, we can have staff clarify a little further how they come to this recommendation given the context that we've just had right now.
Would you like that now? Mr. Mark?
I think you're better to hear from the other presenters and get our policy put forward, Madam Chair.
All right, Councillor Kavanagh?
Thank you very much. When I had a presentation presented to me by Liaison de la Francophonie, they were talking to the neighbors in the community about what their purpose was. And one of the things that they said to me was that they were going to have like an alternate program for high school students, that basically they're going to run a high school in that school. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's similar. After being a trustee for 8 years, I know that our board had done things like that, where we used an older school, and we had, for example, an elementary school that was turned into an alternate high school. And it struck me, it was a very similar idea that they were using the space there to start a high school program for alternate, which they had never had before. Right. And so it's a new program. So I just wanted to confirm that there is a teaching component going on. Having been a trustee, I know that the building has a lot of things in it. We have different examples. For example, Bayshore Public in the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board has partnerships with on giving language lessons to new immigrants. So there's all kinds of things that go on. I don't think they're being punished for it. Thank you very much.
I would just add to your comments, Trustee Kavanagh, that not only is an alternate high school being part of this program, La Cité itself is coming and offering some post-secondary education on this site. It's a Francophone impetus. It's a chance to speak in the French voice at one location in the West End where it's needed. And again, Pierre Tessier will speak to this, that their immigrant community is difficult to serve. Those people don't know how to navigate the services that would typically our existing population would find. So that too is part of the big push. There are organizations going in there to help those people.
It sounds like it's going to have a similar purpose to what we're doing, what had happened in the Anglophone Board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weber.
If it suits the board, I'd ask Pierre Tetreault and Pierre Tessier to come up and make a few comments.
Yes, they are next and last. Bienvenue.
OK. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vais vous donner une chronologie des événements qui ont permis au CPO de s'engager au carrefour communautaire situé au 2720 Richmond. Donc, le 16 octobre 2016, la coopérative multiservice francophone de l'Ouest d'Ottawa, le CMFO, annonce qu'elle cherche un partenaire institutionnel afin d'assurer la viabilité financière de son projet d'établissement. Comme vous savez, ce projet-là était arrêté faute de financement et puisque c'est un groupe, le CMFO, c'est un groupe de bénévoles, ils n'avaient pas l'expertise pour continuer la construction. Donc, le 1er novembre 2016, le CPO et le CMFO ont signé une lettre d'intérêt afin de procéder aux prochaines étapes de transfert de biens de fonds de l'ancienne école Grant. Autrement dit, le CPO deviendrait 100% propriétaire et le CMFO et les autres groupes deviendraient des locataires. Le 7 mars 2017, le gouvernement de l'Ontario confirme, dans une lettre envoyée à la CMFO, qu'elle approuvait le partenariat avec le CPO en vue de mettre en place un carrefour scolaire et communautaire offrant des services communautaires et éducatifs. Le 8 juin 2017, des discussions ont eu lieu avec le ministère de l'Éducation de l'Ontario et le ministère de l'Infrastructure de l'Ontario au sujet de l'achat des terrains de la CMFO et de la Ville d'Ottawa par le CPO. Le 2720 chemin Richmond était constitué de 2 terrains, la partie A sur laquelle on trouvait l'école Grant et la partie B sur laquelle on trouvait l'annexe et la cour arrière qui appartient à la Ville d'Ottawa. Ce qui prévoit un carrefour scolaire et communautaire qui abritera, entre autres, un campus pour l'école des adultes, le carrefour, une école, un pavillon pour l'alternative et des partenaires comme le CMFO. Donc, la gestion propose de poursuivre des discussions avec la Ville et ça a permis d'acheter les 2 terrains que je venais de mentionner. Le 27 juin 2017, le Conseil a approuvé par la résolution que la gestion soit mandatée de négocier et de conclure l'achat des 2 terrains ciblés pour l'établissement d'un carrefour scolaire et communautaire dans le cadre du partenariat CPO-CMFO. Et le 8 septembre 2017, le CPO a soumis ses projets prioritaires en immobilisation au ministère de l'Éducation, qui, lui, a transféré le dossier au ministère de l'Infrastructure. Donc, le 12 décembre 2017, le ministère de l'Infrastructure de l'Ontario a annoncé publiquement que le CPO recevra un montant de 8 950 000 $ pour la réfection de l'ancienne école Grant, l'aménagement des salles communautaires et jardins communautaires, l'ajout, l'aménagement paysager, les stationnements et la démolition de l'ancienne annexe du côté sud. Le 14 décembre 2017, le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Alimentation et des Affaires rurales approuve que le CMFO transfère au CPO la parcelle avant, l'ancien édifice Grant, au CPO. Donc, le 30 mai 2018, le CPO est devenu propriétaire. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. Pierre, did you have anything to say?
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vais continuer, merci.
Quelques questions, quelque chose à dire?
Excellent, merci. Je vais ajouter seulement pour... D'abord, je suis Pierre Tessier, je suis conseiller scolaire. Je représente le conseil aujourd'hui, du côté des élus. Je vais peut-être ajouter quelques points ou faire l'emphase de quelques points. Je réalise que, surtout à la question du conseiller Brockington, que le rôle principal d'un conseil scolaire, c'est d'éduquer les jeunes. Mais aujourd'hui, l'éducation va beaucoup plus loin que ce qui se passe en classe. Si on regarde, surtout dans les communautés francophones, l'établissement d'un hub communautaire ou d'un centre communautaire où on combine l'éducation, ensuite on touche l'éducation des adultes qui n'ont pas encore obtenu leur secondaire. Fait que ça, c'est l'alternative. On ajoute aussi des classes avec la cité collégiale, etc., etc. Mais ce qu'on réalise dans notre conseil, c'est qu'on a aussi un influx d'immigrants qui est énorme. Dans une de nos écoles en particulier, il y a au-dessus de 50 pays qui sont représentés. Alors,
Barhaven.
pour pouvoir, Barhaven et d'autres. Alors, pour pouvoir fournir l'éducation, il faut aussi intégrer ce qu'on fait avec la communauté. Je pense que c'est le futur. Ce n'est pas seulement pour les francophones. Éventuellement, tout le monde va le faire. Alors, nous, on doit créer une ambiance où la famille va envoyer ses enfants à nos écoles, mais en même temps, les parents, qui souvent ne parlent même pas, ne sont pas éduqués ici, ils viennent d'un autre pays, ont besoin d'être intégrés à la communauté. Alors ça inclut les services de santé et toutes les autres choses qu'on a besoin pour pouvoir subsister dans une nouvelle communauté. Alors, notre rôle est de coordonner, de gérer, si tu voulais, ce projet-là, où nous avons des partenaires, comme la Cité collégiale et autres, l'hôpital Montfort, qui vont pouvoir répondre aux besoins de la communauté en même temps que les jeunes vont venir dans nos écoles. Fait qu'on fait ce lien-là de façon à ce qu'on réalise que le rôle d'un conseil scolaire change beaucoup. Et je pense qu'il faut reconnaître ça, même si techniquement, il y a peut-être des arguments à faire, là, mais de notre point de vue, on pense que le rôle qu'on accomplit là, atteint les différents services qui devraient être fournis aux citoyens. Merci.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Kavanagh?
Merci beaucoup. Je m'excuse si je demande mes questions en anglais. I want to thank you for being here. As a former trustee for 8 years, I know that schools can take all forms. And as I was saying earlier to Mr. Weber, I know when the president was definitely an education component, that there was going to be alternate high school, something that our board has done for many, many years, and it's your first opportunity to have a special place for that, which I think is really important, that it's not in a regular high school, that it's in this kind of format. It strikes me that it's the role of schools is that they're changing all the time. As I pointed out earlier with Bayshore Public School, you have a component where you have adults coming in and there's English classes that are actually sponsored by the federal government for newcomers. You're going to be, we have nothing right now that is specifically in the West End for immigrants that are francophones. So, non, je suis très contente d'avoir la cour comme ça, ici, à Ottawa, dans le West. So I just want to ask, can you describe some of the programming in the schools that are specifically for students? Merci.
Pour l'alternative, comme vous savez, c'est pour éviter que nos élèves qui sont de potentiels décrocheurs puissent continuer à avoir leur éducation et obtenir leur diplôme d'études secondaires. Donc, ce sont des élèves qui ne fitent pas dans les écoles régulières et se retrouvent dans une école dont l'éducation est personnalisée pour leur permettre de graduer. Pour l'école de Carrefour, ce sont souvent effectivement des immigrants, des adultes qui proviennent de d'autres pays, qui n'ont pas eu la chance d'obtenir leur diplôme d'études secondaires, qui vont pouvoir avoir accès à un édifice beaucoup plus près de chez eux dans l'ouest d'Ottawa.
Donc, c'est presque la même de l'école avec l'autre ancien conseil the Adult High School.
Oui, exactement.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Brockington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I sat in this room 11 years ago when the formerly named committee that was formerly before FEDCO was considering whether or not to buy the old Grant Public School and Bayview School sites. And I was here, and I was speaking in favor of those acquisitions because of the hub concept. I don't think anyone's debating the merits of a hub. We understand the benefits to communities to co-congregate multiple services under one roof, or at least to attach them in the areas. And no one argues that school boards can facilitate many purposes in addition to educating students between the ages of 3 and 21. I think we acknowledge that. What I'm trying to figure out today is whether or not, given the intended purposes, that qualifies for a DC refund or not. That's what we're trying to get at here today. That's what I'm trying to get at here today. So I heard in your presentation that the new building will be used, you specifically said that the translated words were adult education and alternative education. Those services, does that go towards the acquisition of a secondary school diploma? Or when you use the words adult education, is that the type of services like, non-credit earning courses? Is it cooking courses, financial planning courses, child rearing courses? That is education, but I'm looking at, is it specifically courses mandated under a school board by the Education Act?
Yes.
Or other? It is?
It is.
Okay. And so I've got questions for staff based on that.
Any other questions of the delegation? Okay, so hang on. So I'm going to go to Councillor Blais.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Si tu payes le complet et tu ne reçois pas un remboursement, c'est quoi l'impact à le programme que tu veux offrir à l'école?
Si on paye toutes les redevances, les frais de redevance,
Oui.
La première chose, c'est d'avoir un impact sur le projet de construction parce que c'est déjà un gros montant qu'on doit enlever du projet de construction qui est environ 400 000 $. Donc, c'est 400 000 $ de moins dans l'amélioration, l'aménagement des locaux. Ce que ça crée naturellement, c'est qu'à ce moment-là, comme vous savez, dans l'entente, le conseil doit utiliser l'édifice au moins à 50 %. Et l'autre 50 %, c'était l'entente avec la Ville que ce soit utilisé par la communauté francophone pour les services francophones, en passant pour des organisations à but non lucratif. Donc, ça a un impact au niveau financier, surtout sur la construction dans ce cas-ci.
Ça va changer le temps de construction ou la qualité? Ou...
La qualité de la construction,
Okay.
oui.
Merci beaucoup.
Anyone else? No? Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Paul, do you just want to sit there? Can you sit there quietly and not speak? Okay, rather than me call you up after. So, Councillor Brockington, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I'm trying to get at is the intended purpose of the site, the expanded site, because that, for me, will determine whether or not there should be a refund or not. The staff report does not mention adult education. This is on page 4 of what the building will be used for. So I need to ask staff, we've heard from the delegates of the school board. They're telling us what the building will be used for. That seems to qualify for a development charge refund, but that's not articulated in the report. So what am I missing?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Richard Ash for Building Code Services. So staff had the task with that a tight mandate to make that determination of the use of that space. We are also only looking at, if you can appreciate, the addition, like the new square footage. And we had a number of ways we went about that once an exemption was looked at. One was the website, looking to understand what a community hub is and could be, and how the space was utilized by the board. And if you look at the bottom of page 3, under the discussion, we listed the uses that were listed on the architectural drawings. There were discussions had, and that was the agreed upon use. No, there was no change in the uses. We were looking at change rooms, community center, there's a kitchen in there. There was classrooms identified in the existing building that was being repurposed, but the new square footage, in staff's mind, it was used as a community. It's a community center more.
So can you remind the committee what the justification is for the partial reimbursement then? What has triggered that?
The partial refund is during the appeal, there was a review of the file, and it was determined that there was a number of different applications made. There was square footage changes. There was a downsizing of the original size of the building due to costs. And during those back and forths, an error was made in the calculation and the new gross square footage. And so it was determined that a refund was appropriate based on based on the square footage, but that the intent was still to charge based on the use.
And finally, my last question, Madam Chair, if I may, to Mr. Mark. Mr. Mark, did the city review other cases in other municipalities where they are under similar type of requests?
So the answer is in part yes and in part no. I did not approach the other municipalities to determine if they had collected development charges with respect to community hubs. What I did do was look at where other community hubs had located in Ontario. And to be sure, there are former schools that are being used as community hubs. But I also found a library that had space repurposed to a community hub, a medical arts building that had been repurposed to a community hub, and then in one municipality, it was greenfield construction. It was a new facility that was constructed as a community hub. And I don't know if it was provided to committee, but Mr. Weber was kind enough to provide me with material on Monday, which included a letter from the Ministry of Education, a memo from the Deputy Minister dated August 10th, 2015, to directors of education throughout the province. And what it says in the second paragraph, the mandate of the advisory group dealing with community hubs was to review provincial policies and develop a framework for adapting existing public properties. So it's not a reference just to schools. It is, what I would suggest is something that makes sense, is where are public buildings not being fully utilized, be they schools, be they libraries, be they whatever, and how can we repurpose those to community hubs? And it's information such as this, and also text from the minister's press release that I included in the report that led staff to the conclusion that a community hub goes beyond school purposes, and therefore development charges should be applicable.
Thank you for that. Last week, many councillors attended the annual fundraiser at the Boys and Girls Club in Hogsback, which we officially opened. That Boys and Girls Club serves many needs, many purposes. I won't go into it. We're all aware of what the Boys and Girls Clubs. They asked me to assist them with the refund of their DCs, and I said no. The Carlington Community Health Centre is going through a major expansion. We have put in a 42-unit OCH seniors building. It is truly a hub, serving 3 or 4 different wards. They've asked for a refund of their DCs. The answer is no. I'm open to a greater discussion about whether or not we should consider the refund of DCs for particular construction serving particular segments of our communities in a global discussion. But it's very risky when we have these one-off type of requests, because you have to ask yourself, why is a certain group eligible and not others? And so the case can be fairly made for other types of organizations that exist who have gone through very similar circumstances where we've said no. So I'm willing to support the staff recommendation based on their explanation today, but I won't be asking or supporting any other reduction.
Thank you. Councillor Blais?
Thank you. Mr. Mark, you referenced a news release from the minister. Which minister issued the news release?
Ministry of Infrastructure, Mr. Shirelli.
Mr. Shirelli, and the funding came from that ministry, or was it a program of the Ministry of the Education?
So Mr. Weber said the Ministry of Education, and I can't say that that's wrong. I can say that in the package of information that he provided to me, the announcement of the funding came from the office of the, I'm going to say Assistant Deputy Minister, ADM, I don't know what that is, Ministry of Infrastructure.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Cavanagh?
Thank you. I think the big difference here in terms of talking about the community hub aspect is the fact that this is a school board that's operating this building. And we're having this discussion because it's new construction, not an evolution of something that quietly happened in the background. This is something that's new. And quite frankly, it's pretty essential for the West End. It's something that is going to be a continuum of education. Was that not taken into consideration, the fact that this is going to be for education so that Francophones can keep their language and that they're in the West End? Because we've heard very, very clearly that this is going to be used as an alternate high school. So the hub is part of that. It's part of keeping the French language in the West End. That's extremely important. And I'm hoping that we can help them to do that. Is that not been taken into consideration, the fact that this is a continuum and that it's a school board?
Madam Chair, there's, in my opinion, there's a two-part test to the exemption of school boards. And I just want to mention City Collegiale. City Collegiale was a Crown agent, and so as a Crown agent, they're exempt from laws unless the laws expressly say to the contrary. The Development Charges Act doesn't say to the contrary. That's why they didn't pay. With respect to school boards and municipalities, it's a two-part test. The first question is, are they owned by the municipality or the school board? Clearly they are, but that's not the end of the story. The fact that the municipality or the school board has the legal power to own the land does not get them to the exemption. It has to be used for the purposes. And when staff did an analysis, you've heard the explanation, which I will not repeat, we came to the conclusion that it did not come within the purposes of the board within the meaning of the Development Charges Act.
I guess I'm hearing contrary information because we clearly heard that it was going to be used as an alternate high school as well, and that there'll be adult education there, formal adult education, not cooking classes or anything else, but actual adult education. And this is a school board. I also think it's a pretty strong argument that the other school boards, the coterminous boards, are supporting this because they're going to be in similar situations as they evolve because you know, schools just aren't the same anymore. They're being used for everything, including daycares, et cetera. And I just want to know if this has been taken into consideration.
So, Madam Chair, we certainly did reflect in the report and acknowledged that the four boards are in support of the French Public Board in this instance. However, we came to the conclusion on the statutory language that we arrived at, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper?
And forgive me, you may have answered this before, Mr. Mark, but what is staff's determination as to what the purpose of the school board is?
It's at the end of the day, it's a chief building official who makes that determination, and so I'm going to pass that to Mr. Ash.
So thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if I can elaborate any more other than, these are discussions and that go on when we try to get to the essence and of the intent of the act. So we have the act, we have our development charge bylaw, we have the wording that we go by, and based on the discussions we had at the time, based on the uses that were determined and shown on the plans, that was the staff's decision. I can't go on, I don't know where else to.
But I still don't hear, if you've determined that it is not in keeping with the purpose of the school board, then you must have some definition of what the purpose of the school board is.
Well, that I can assist you with, Madam Chair, and I put that in the report. And just bear with me for a moment. Page 4. So I heard Councillor Brockington ask for the purposes of the school board, and I didn't put that in there, but I did put in the purposes of the Education Act. And so I'm going to go to section 0.1, the second one. The purpose of education is to provide students with the opportunity to realize their potential and develop into highly skilled, knowledgeable, caring citizens who contribute to their society. And it's staff's view that what is being provided goes beyond that, goes beyond the concept of providing students with these opportunities and goes to community serving uses. And that's where we see the difference, Madam Chair.
So I'm looking at the Government of Ontario's website, the Ministry of Education's website, at the Francophone education policy that they have in place. And the Francophone education policy which guides secondary and secondary school, or sorry, post-secondary and school boards, notes that, part of the government's mandate that they've given to boards and post-secondary institutions is to increase the capacity of learning communities, including school staff, students, and parents, to support students' linguistic, educational, and cultural development throughout their lives, as well as expand and enrich the Francophone environment through solid partnerships between the school, families, and the community as a whole. Why would we not take a fairly expansive definition of what the board's purpose is in taking a look at the education policy that the ministry has outlined?
Madam Chair, that's where I come back to the two-part test. It seems to me that in going beyond saying the lands are owned by the school board or the lands are owned by the municipality, that their purposes must be something else, and it must be a limitation on the first test. Otherwise, there's no reason for that second test. And in looking at that, staff came to the conclusion that when you're looking at something that serves a broad community function that goes beyond the purpose that I just read out, that such a function is subject to development charges for a building that's constructed to serve that function.
I disagree. I take a more expansive view of what the school board's purpose is. I'm going to vote against the staff recommendation, and if the staff recommendation is defeated, I will put forward a motion to exempt the development from development charges.
Okay, so having, I think Councillor Shirelli and I are the only ones that have the history of when the former Grant School first came to be of interest to anyone. And it's 11 or 12 years ago for sure. But at the time, there never was, the argument was always that it was a community hub. It was an argument about a community hub over and above the fact that it was ever a school in the early days. It was like a place, because in the West End there was a vacuum of services for a Francophone. And certainly at the time, I mean, I can remember back then, I think we had maybe Pierre Elliott Trudeau's school, because Jean wasn't open. I didn't have, like I have 5 now in just in Barrhaven. And so we did not have, for sure, and in Canada didn't have the numbers that it has now. So the community hub, where a cultural center still remains, schools have made a remarkable investment for both of the Francophone boards. And so but I want to make sure that, it's one thing to say that the other school boards are not going to contest this or anything like that, but I really think that, we have rules for a reason and we have precedents that can be set. That concerns me. Please, somebody in the room might remember the Briere village that they built. Briere Continuing Care built the village, the community village down in the Hiawatha Park area in Orleans. Did we charge them development charges? Because I think that's right around the time when things changed, and because we had been exempting some people, but that is quite a while ago too. We made some changes vis-a-vis our ability to help out hospitals. Mr. Mark?
I do not know. You will have that answer well before council, Madam Chair.
Okay, I think that that's important to have, because again, I think that community hubs, the definition of community hubs can be very, very different. And I think the other thing that's different about this is that the CPO is a very small board in a very large area, has a large area that it serves. And I think that that's an extra nuance, if you will, that puts a pressure onto what they want to do. But the bottom line is that way back when, a community hub was what the Francophone community of Ottawa was looking for at this place. And it's evolved into what it is today, and we're really happy that it has. But at this point, I'm going to be supporting the staff recommendation. And anyone else want to say anything? Do you want yeas and nays on this, Councillor Kavanagh?
Well, I don't get a vote here, but
But I can still ask you.
I definitely...
Yeas and nays.
Yes.
I can still ask you if you wanted yeas and nays. Okay, so on the Yes, sure you can.
Mr. Mark, clearly the committee's recommendation can be amended at council one way or the other?
Yes, and it's also subject to appeal by the school board if
Of course.
they don't like the
So in
result.
addition to the request that Councillor Harder's made relative to Briere Continuing Care, I'd like to get a sense of if development charges were paid by CPO on the sports dome in Gloucester, in Blackburn Hamlet specifically, and any other co-located projects on school board property, say within the last 10 years,
How many years?
a decade? I don't know. Is that reasonable?
If it's not, we'll get back to the councillor, Madam Chair.
Okay, that's
Thank you.
awesome. All right, everyone, so yeas and nays on the development charges, 2720 Richmond Road. Councillor Dudas? This is on the staff report.
Yes.
Councillor Gower?
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli? Councillor Leeper?
No.
Councillor Brockington? Yes. Councillor Blais? Councillor Moffat? Oh. Councillor Hubley?
Yes.
Vice Chair Tierney?
Yes.
Pardon? Yes. And myself, yes. Okay, thank you very much. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1. Thank you for coming out today. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Weber for a few moments, if you will.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's now 50 years since I first appeared at the Ontario Municipal Board, 30 of those years on behalf of municipalities and public institutions, and when my clients all became Mr. Mark's clients in 2000, I've been able to appear for the development industry and private practice and so on. Tim has taken good care of them, but I've enjoyed my time on the dark side. But this all ends with my retirement this summer. Maybe my last opportunity to appear before this committee, I want to take a brief moment to thank you, Madam Chair, and your predecessors, and all the members of the committees going back over those 50 years. As you know, the standard of decision-making must always be that justice be done and be seen to be done. I don't say the decisions were always just, but there was a corrective at the OMB when they were particularly egregious, and I'm delighted to see that coming back into practice, as I'm sure Mr. Willis would outline for you. But justice always appeared to be done. Councils were always respectful during the 5 minutes allowed for presentation. I found very little grandstanding over the years, and when there were chairs to call that back into order. So I have been fairly treated here. I have never had a fear of coming to this committee. I go back a long way. Gordon Hunter was your initial predecessor here. He began teaching school with my late wife in 1968, so I go back forever. And of course, Chair Harder, I won't comment on how long you've been around. I don't think that would be fair, but as I recall, you were drawing the baby bonus when I first met you on the PN Council. Those days are over. So I never approach these hearings in fear and trembling. I'm glad to end it as I did today, appearing for a public institution, particularly a Francophone institution. It says so much about how relations have developed that they have the courage to hire an Anglophone lawyer because he has experience in an area, and I have the courage to act for them. It's great to end it here at the Ottawa Normal School. As I said, my mother was a graduate, and if you go on the haunted walk of Ottawa, or one of them, they always point out that the Kiefer room is haunted, and that's sort of the selling point. It was the science classroom, and I guess I can reveal now that it's not quite true. It is the spirit of my mother, and I never felt fear at the Kiefer room. I was there for worship. Finally, as you move on to the consideration of another grand plan for the next generation, I wish you success. You have a hard job, and all the committees before you had hard jobs and hard decisions to make. And however they resulted, they were made fairly in terms of appearances. So I'm certain that the next one will end as well as so many of the others have. On my part, I promise not to kibitz from the bleachers. I am truly gone after this summer. And while I may make the odd inappropriate comment, I wish you God's blessing and Godspeed. And Councillor Kavanagh, would you please take Councillor Brockington over to 440 Albert Street before the council vote in this matter? Enlighten them.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for taking the time to sign out today. I know I've appreciated, I wasn't collecting the baby bonus. I guess I look younger than I am. It's the hair, what can I say? But thank you very much. Okay. We are going now to our other held item, which is the 2019 Development Charges, Background Studies, and Bylaws. And Mr. Willis is our General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development, is in the driver's seat. He's got a supporting cast along with him. And as I said earlier, he's going to do a separate presentation on Bill 108 and what we actually know about it right now, which is not everything, because it's that new. Important piece of work. Charmaine Forgy is with him, and Gary Baker. And I don't know whether Mr. Mark is staying or not. Yes, he is. Oh yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, Madam Chair, it's important that we acknowledge that this is a public meeting under the Development Charges Act for the purposes. Mr. Mark, Mr. Baker, Ms. Forgy are at the table with me here to assist in making this presentation to you today and answering any questions. I also have staff from Transportation Services, Parks and Recreation and Culture Facilities. The City Treasurer is also in the audience as well, so we have a number of people available to assist as required. As the Chair indicated at the beginning of the presentation, we intend to do a separate presentation on Bill 108 at the end of this session, and I would ask your indulgence that questions related to Bill 108 we would leave to that portion as they relate to development charges or any other matter we discuss, and Mr. Mark's going to actually assist me in that presentation. But I do think it's worthwhile giving you a quick snapshot of how Bill 108 affects development charges, and then, as I said, we'll talk more later on. There are, under Bill 108, which amends a number of pieces of legislation, there are changes to the Development Charges Act, and the significant changes to the Act, the biggest ones that they change, are how they relate to secondary suites, where secondary suites would be exempted from development charges. Soft services under the Development Charges Act, and we'll go into this in more detail, will no longer be collected under development charges. They would have to be collected through a separate mechanism called a community benefits charge. And there's a number of changes to the way we would have to administer the Development Charges Act in the new legislation. But the reason I need your indulgence today to focus on adopting this bylaw under the current legislation is, should we not adopt this bylaw, we will not be collecting development charges in Ottawa after June 11th. So we do need to adopt it under the current legislation, so that's the context I'd like to set for this presentation. So quickly, to give you an overview of how the methodology, and this is, for councillors who've been here a number of terms would recognize this basic formula. The province has set a very, very specific process of how you calculate development charges, and one of the lessons I learned since I've been on the job here at the City of Ottawa is not a lot of room for creativity in the way you do it, because it is all dictated by law or regulation. This development charges bylaw is based on a growth projection forecast until 2031. And even though our official plan now goes to 2036, the reason why we couldn't do a growth projection forecast beyond 2031 is our transportation master plan and our infrastructure master plan only go to 2031. So in the next version of the bylaw, we will catch up to be concurrent with the official plan numbers as they will exist after we're done the new process. The council sponsors group direction that gave to us and the suggestions on how to approach this is we were not adding new projects, and you can't add new projects to a development charges bylaw unless they exist in an approved plan, and with no changes to the transportation master plan or infrastructure master plan, we were, that we were unable to add new projects to this bylaw. So we're taking the same list of projects from the last time and rolling them over to the new bylaw with the growth projections remaining between now and 2031. We did a number of stakeholder one additional point. We did take the 2013 projects list, and where we had updated cost estimates as a result of further study by staff in transportation or infrastructure services, we used the most up-to-date cost estimate possible. And where we didn't have a newer cost estimate, we applied inflation so that we brought it up to contemporary costing estimates. We had a stakeholder engagement process. We met with FCA in February. We released the draft study online in March on March 15th and sent a link to that online study to all of the stakeholders who identified an interest. We met with the development industry in a number of separate meetings between December and April, and a lot of the discussion was not about, again, not about adding or deleting projects. It was primarily focused over how the calculations were done, the methodology of transition, and some of the matters, and I believe some of the speakers will talk to some of those matters today. We had meetings with the council sponsors group, and we also provided sessions in the last number of days for councillors who are either interested in a refresher on how the Act works, or for those who had not been through the process before. We provided a series of, we call it a development charges primer sessions for it as well. We also, this whole process couldn't have happened without the Interdepartmental Steering Committee, so I thank my colleagues in other departments. So fundamentally, development charges is the legislative basis for recovering the capital costs incurred by growth through projects identified in approved plans, and we must follow at all times the Development Charges Act. Development charges recover the capital costs where, in addition to the costs that would be normally constructed, because there's certain costs in a subdivision that developers pay for directly, these would be the charges beyond those that apply, and development charges can only be levied on growth-related elements. So we cannot use it to renovate existing facilities or use it for other capital spending we would otherwise wish to do. We're not allowed to do that. So the Development Charges Act also requires, and this is one of the more complex parts of the legislation, is that we calculate our level of service for any, particularly the soft services, which are not projects that are hard with capital cost estimates based on the historic 10-year average level of service we provided. So, and I know that we've had discussions with certain councillors and people at the table about, for example, libraries. You cannot put more towards libraries unless that has been the level of service you've had for the last 10 years. So we do update what the historic level of service has been, but that is the limitation the law actually provides. And this applies to parks, recreation, libraries, protection services such as fire and police, those ones that are not hard capital projects. I thought this was an interesting slide. I don't know how easy it is to read on the screen. If your screen's in front of you, have it. This is an annual profile of our development charges collections and our receipts on a month-by-month basis that was provided to us by Finance. I think it's interesting to note that in this previous bylaw we had, the lower lines on the chart are the first couple of years in the bylaw, and actually each year of the bylaw we've accrued more and more revenue over the life, and that relates to one of the most important things about the development charges is our revenues are always related to how much development is actually happening. It's because it is based on the time we issue building permits in the system. And we always have this spike mid-year in any year because that's around the time we apply the inflationary increases every single year where we raise our rates by inflation. And because it's totally legal to do this, people knowing that we're going to raise it by inflation every year try to get their permits approved before we do that. That is allowed under the law, and it is a function of our annual receipts. But I thought it's just an interesting kind of sense of how our revenues come in every year. The good news is we're raising more, and based on the first quarter so far, our application counts are up in the order of between 15% and 25%, depending on the type of application. So I would imagine the rest of this year will again be a higher line than last year. But we are beholden to broader economic cycles, and there is no guarantee of the rate of revenue coming in because of those economic cycles. So we issued the draft background study and made a number of changes to the background study based on the discussions and the input from stakeholders, including staff and sponsors group and external stakeholders. One of the most significant bits of change we have done to address one of the issues that came out of our R4 planning study is that rooming dwelling units is a new category in the bylaw that didn't exist in the previous bylaw, and that's to address those rooming house style units that were paying a very low development charges rate. They were categorized in the same category as a nursing home, and now they're being a category based on their own use, which is a person per unit, which is what those things are typically built as, and it will raise their development charges they need to pay, which would reduce some of the disincentives to build these things as proper apartments that exist in the financial disincentives we've been trying to address as an outcome of the R4 study. So again, we made the major changes to the bunkhouse regulations, and this will be a financial tool that reinforces that decision council previously made. I can't emphasize enough how formulaic these calculations are. So I wanted to give you a sample calculation of how any service is calculated. So this is just an example. So the law sets what we can talk about in terms of we have a capital cost and the amount we can charge during this period, minus a series of statutory deductions. So there, in a number of instances, and it varies depending on the use, the law requires that we deduct an amount. And the theory behind the law is that any capital works, yes, it's primarily being used by growth and new population, but to a certain extent it's used by people who are already here as well. You imagine a segment of road is built, it's not 100% used by new people, it's to a certain extent used. So the law sets that, that's not our discretion, they set those statutory deduction rates. And then we divide it by the projected number of residential or non-residential developments going to happen during the development period. So we just give you a simple calculation where we have 1.6 million of a cost over 139,000 units. Did I get that right, Gary? I think so. I didn't mix million and billion? No. And therefore you will arrive at 11,000 per capita development charge rate for that project. So it's just a sample calculation. This is not necessarily related to what's in here. It's just to give you a sense of how this is actually calculated. So this is the resulting lists of the new development charges rates. Apartments are we still use apartments for comparison within the Greenbelt because it's the predominant unit type between the old and the new rates. And we use single and semi-detached units outside the Greenbelt because they're the predominant development units, so you can understand the rate increase. So inside the Greenbelt, singles are going up considerably based on the calculation by 23%. Outside the Greenbelt, singles and semi-detached are going up 4%, and that has to do a lot with the projects that were in the previous bylaw have been built. There are fewer projects, lower costs. We built up some reserves and we're required to apply that. That is, again, driven by math, not by policy. In the rural area, a little bit of the opposite side where the projects had not been built and the population growth hasn't been as high, so therefore the math ends up with a higher rate of 18%. And Mr. Baker is the genius of this and would happily help me answer questions if we need to get into this a bit more. Outside the Greenbelt and in the area-specific charges area, again, it's 4 and 11% growth. For the non-residential component, industrial, because these are citywide charges, the industrial charge goes up 9% and the non-industrial goes up 17%. Now, the big driver of the increase inside the Greenbelt is we've added a number of new park projects that were not previously considered, as I said, because of approved plans, and those are community design plans that have been adopted that identify new urban parks. So they are eligible to be added. And a number of the downtown inter-urban councillors had remarked to us about the fact that we had not raised a lot of money to implement these parks with the intensification. So it is meeting the policy objective of trying to raise the money to deliver on those promises related to intensification. Outside the Greenbelt, as I said, the charges are more modest. Overall, these increases in charges represent between 5 to 7% of the cost of new homes in Ottawa, which we've basically over the years continued to have roughly the same band, so that's a bit of a measure of the impact on affordability. We haven't varied outside that band on affordability. So important timelines. The development charges bylaw, it will come before council on May 22nd, 2019, and that is required to have it in place because the new bylaw will expire, the old bylaw will expire June 11th. Happy to answer any questions. As I said, I have a team of people to assist me and glad to clarify anything.
We have a good number of people that want to speak to us in delegations, so we're going to go right to the delegations first. Thank you for your presentation. First up is Drew Meerveld. Drew is with the Somerset West Community Health Centre. For the information of Drew and everyone coming after him, we have 5 minutes for presentation by the delegations. Welcome, Drew. Do you have a presentation, or are you just no? Yeah.
No,
Perfect.
just
Thank
just
you.
speaking. Absolutely, thanks. I think it's probably worth starting off by echoing Mr. Weber's sentiments. I've lived a lifetime less than him, but I'm appreciative of kind of the safe atmosphere that that exists here for this kind of dialogue. So thank you to each of you for being here today. As mentioned, my name's Drew Meerveld. I'm speaking on behalf of Somerset West Community Health Center, but also the Inclusive Neighborhoods Coalition. Now, it's a coalition that has coalesced around a number of key asks for the official plan in the lead up and during the consultation process, and it's been an illuminating process for me. I'm by no means an expert, but it's been a wonderful experience speaking to different professors and community groups and urban planners and builders from the private and public sector. The plan, or the asks rather writ large, include a lot of different pieces, whether it be an equity and inclusion lens, whether it be really zoning in on inclusionary zoning and developing thoughtful policy that goes beyond just blanket percentage to explore thresholds and compliance alternatives and the resilience of some areas versus others, as a means not to pit urban versus rural, and I think that's really been a key focus of ours. But the reason I'm here to talk to you today, and this will echo some of the sentiments that the Green Space Alliance also speaks to you about, is on the topic of development charges. Now, I think in the open letter, you've probably all read it, one of the key points or key lines, calling cards, is growth paying for growth. And this isn't something that's meant to be an antagonistic NIMBY versus developer idea, but rather a solution or a principle that begins to get at building sustainable cities. Now, I acknowledge what Mr. Willis said, and he's far more an expert on this particular topic than I am, in that these pieces are rigid. But within that rigid legislation, it seems to me that there is still an opportunity for considerable discretion. And when it comes to discretion in assigning a sort of discount value to the community value that a development allows, I think that's completely valid. But at the same time, I think we need to begin to take a really holistic view of what intensification means to our city. Now, to me, intensification is not by any means a nefarious term. It's something that is pregnant with possibility. You talk about living beside your neighbors in close proximity and sharing experiences. I feel like that's one of the highest goods that we in a city, whether it be suburban or urban, get to experience. But it also means that we have to be aware of some of the challenges that come up. So whether that be well-established relationships between crime and concrete, whether it be well-established ideas of isolationism and some of the mental health challenges that emerge when people live in high-rises. We want people in these environments to be able to be their best selves. And in order to do that, I think it's important that we recognize that development charges or funding of the like paves the way for the social infrastructure that really helps and supports people living in environments. So I think it's incumbent upon us within this rigid context to get a little bit creative with what we do. Now, a couple of things we've heard from various academics and urban planners are an enhancing of sub-regional specifications as far as what costs are attributed where. Ottawa is long regarded in urban planning circles as a leader for having 4 zones, but really the needs of different neighborhoods outstrips any consideration associated with different bureaucratic costs by expanding those areas or the costs in them. I think another piece is considering special area charges. In the same way that Millennium Park gives extra money to parks, or Provence Avenue has some sewer issues, so too do urban intensified and suburban intensified areas have different issues that are worth beginning to address and understanding. And lastly, being cognizant of the time, I think if one is so jaded towards the idea of development charges and its ability to respond effectively to the challenges and opportunities that we're facing, then something like a tax increment financing program may be in order.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
And listen, very well said. I mean, I think you covered a ton of stuff, and I wanted to point out that your comments about our official plan process and how that's evolving, Mr. Alain Migalis is our lead person on that, so I'm sure he'd like to have, if you haven't chatted with him, you should have a conversation. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Mirveld? Thank you very much for coming out today.
Thanks.
Next up is Terry Mian, Vice President, Healthy Transportation Coalition. Terry, are you here? There you are. How are you today? Good. You know how to turn on that mic. You've been here before.
Yes. I always forget. I apologize. Hi. Well, thanks for having me again. I'm drawing a blank. My apologies. So I'll see how I do. As the previous speaker said, we need an equity inclusion lens. My concern is the development charges. The consultation. Is there much consultation with the people affected, not just the developers, but the people who are surround the developments? I'd like to see a broader consultation with all affected. An example I have is I previously lived on San Laurent Boulevard, right beside a development that came in, and it was at the corner. My sidewalk was blocked. I lived in an OCH building, and basically, people in the building who couldn't walk as well, with strollers, with other concerns. We were trapped because the developer was given free rein to create the building, and the surrounding area wasn't consulted in how it was going to affect us. So I'm just wondering, when you do these development charges, do you think about how it's going to affect the surrounding community, and how will you enhance the community, not be a detriment? Because that's what I'm seeing, is detriments to the surrounding community, so that a developer can create another building.
So you probably heard Mr. Willis when he was talking about the fact that the timing that we have that this will be in play ties very much into the infrastructure master plan and the transportation master plan. And through those and the official plan, that really tells us how we're going to grow the city, where we're going to grow it, how we're going to grow it. And you know, over the next 12 years, we need something over $7 billion. To get that money, there's a mathematical equation. Am I explaining this well enough, Mr. Willis? There's a mathematical equation. So for the large part, the time that you take, and I see Ms. Parry here today, and Erwin Dreesen and other people who take tons of time. You come out here, you participate, you're involved in the official plan, you're involved in the transportation master plan, you're involved in the infrastructure master plan. You're telling us where we need sidewalks, you're telling us where we need cycling lanes, you're telling us where we need better transit. All of those things come together, but in the end, that's absolutely the important stuff, but the development charges are mathematical, and that's why I think there was that one slide that you showed that clearly showed that component piece. And Mr. Baker, who's sitting beside him, he takes all of that information and how to afford the things that you've said matter. Okay. And I know that you are participating a lot in many things here at the city, because it's not the first time you've been here.
Yes, but I don't understand why I'm not, or the development, like they're allowed to build taller buildings and all that, and take away our parks, take away use of our sidewalks,
but that isn't what today's about, and not what the vote is about. It's about how do we collect the money to afford the major plans that we have at the city in the time frame that they have. Miss Phoebe Chi is here. She's the manager. Is it manager or director? Director of Transportation Planning. And she has a pot of money that is very much tied to specific projects. We have to, through Mr. Baker and his equation, we have to find the way with the growth where we've said there could be growth to actually afford to do that. So that's really what we're doing with today. We're talking about how to afford all those things that you talked about. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions?
How do we get more, those of us who can't afford these new developments, get a say in making sure that they don't make it harder for us to get around, to enjoy the city?
Mr. Willis, did you want to say?
Yeah, so encourage the deputy to talk to Mr. Miguelez about involvement in the official plan and the policies we set related to new infill development and what our planning requirements are. And Ms. Cheese also here can talk about mobility within the city. These issues need to be dealt with on a planning policy level. This is not a development charges issue, which is what the developers need to pay as they build. So I think your issues, we would be very interested in addressing those issues. Accessibility is really important to us. So it's best to kind of focus in on that process.
Thank you very much for coming out today. Next up, we have Trevor Hache. Are you here, Trevor? I didn't see you in the audience. Oh, there you are. Trevor Hache, Healthy Transportation Coalition. Followed by Doug Thompson.
Good morning, members of the Planning Committee and city staff. I'm going to just start by reading the open letter sent to Council from the Green Space Alliance of Canada's capital, the Federation of Citizens Associations of Ottawa, and the Healthy Transportation Coalition on May 7th. So I'm speaking to page 1 of the letter, and it's my understanding Rob Barnes from Ecology Ottawa is going to speak to page 2. So it says, "Dear members of Council, subject development charges are everybody's business." And it says that the City of Ottawa has conducted its periodic review of the development charges in a manner that has excluded input from the public except for advice from the development industry. The letter points out that between December and March, staff and consultants met 13 times with development representatives. An informal group of community representatives were briefed just once, and it was a subset of the community, I would say. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a particularly diverse subset of the community. While professing to have growth pay for growth, the city has listened to only one side, which aims to have the charges as low as possible. Infrastructure costs not covered by the development charges have to be picked up by the property taxpayers across the city. While much of the calculation of the development charges is prescribed by law, considerable discretion remains, including what capital projects benefit the city as a whole or primarily certain areas, to what extent a project benefits existing settlement areas, and to what extent geographic differences and costs are recognized. There's much room for discretion and fair debate. Prior to staff starting the background study, no policy options or guiding principles were put before the public and council. The background study does not present the analysis and results in a manner that's accessible to the lay person. And so we request that the city today commit to having an open and transparent process for the next round of development charges review. This 2019 review is labeled interim, the one that's before you today, because it's based on outdated information. An update of the transportation and infrastructure master plans, which normally forms the basis of the development charges calculation, will not be completed until 2021 or 2022. So the projections of population, housing, and employment are vintage 2013. The capital program is essentially the same as was considered in 2014. The background study describes in only the vaguest of terms how the information was updated. So I'm now going to go away from what the letter says and just share some comments that I think many members of the Healthy Transportation Coalition have. By way of background, the coalition is a group of 33 different organizations, more than 200 individual members. We're working to make Ottawa better for pedestrian cyclists, people who have mobility challenges, and public transit riders. We put a great focus of our work on transportation equity. We're having actually a session at the University of Ottawa next Wednesday that we would love to invite everyone on this committee to consider attending, as well as Hélène Migueles and other relevant city staff, in which we're hoping, we're bringing in experts from across Canada to talk about the types of things that the city needs to do to bring a greater focus to equity within the official plan and the transportation master plan. And we've had very, very good conversations with staff about trying to get people to come to that workshop. It's Wednesday, May the 15th, and all of you should have received an invitation. So certainly our impression, and I don't know that this was discussed, is that growth isn't paying for growth all the time, or certainly not 100% of the costs are being covered. And so it'd be good to know exactly what the sense is as to how much is not being covered and what can be done to address that. The other thing I would point out is that the city does have this equity and inclusion lens. And I share Councillor Harder's feeling that, you know, this stuff is complicated. It's math and other important calculations go into it, and I certainly don't understand it all. But I think the city has a duty and a responsibility to translate the knowledge that the great public servants have and other people have here at City Hall to help the public understand this, because certainly development charges are very impactful on the city's budget and its ability to pay for the good things that the city needs, including infrastructure. So I'm just sharing the Equity Inclusion Lens Handbook. It's my understanding it should be applied to all of the decision-making that occurs in the city, and that's the city's own policy. It's not clear how it was applied in this case because, as we heard, the public was largely excluded. There are groups that are at risk of exclusion, the ones that I will list up above, and they face the consequences of that exclusion every day. So we're just urging the city to do better the next time it updates this and to form a working group with residents, and ideally the working group would include folks from diversity of backgrounds, including those listed here.
Thank you, and Councillor Brockington has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hache, for coming. I appreciate your submission, and I agree with you wholeheartedly about the city having a duty and responsibility to help explain this to the public. I think this is a very significant endeavor when we're updating this bylaw and talking about what the amount should be, particularly to fund growth. I don't want to put you on the spot, but ideally, what would an open and transparent process look like? You've identified some marginalized communities, but just talk about process to help me going forward.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was at the planning committee a couple months ago, and Jan spoke very passionately about the official plan and how the public should be excited, and this is great, and we agree. And so to us, transparency is fundamental to excitement and understanding the process. And so I think that having a working group formed for the next time would be wonderful, including a diversity of people in that working group would be important. Allowing perhaps people that are part of that working group to then go back to their communities, some of whom are listed here. I think there's 11 different groups that are at risk of exclusion, and informing them and trying to do knowledge translation for them. And the fact is, this stuff takes time. It does take time to build up knowledge amongst people. But I'm sure that if folks were given the time and the space to consider the complexities of this and to learn a little bit about how the calculations are done and where perhaps the city in the past has not collected 100% of the charges back from the folks, the developers and the home buyers and whatnot that are causing this growth, and what the implications are to low-density suburban areas where I live in Canada, not necessarily having the population density to totally cover the costs of all the infrastructure that's required to feed these areas with clean water and roads and things like that. I think you would get very good input from folks, and I think ultimately they would probably be very supportive of the city's stated goals, which is to encourage greater density around public transit hubs, to encourage social housing near rapid transit, to encourage a greater transition away from our car-centric development toward more public transit and walking and biking. And so I think it takes time, Councillor Brockington. I think it takes intention. And I think it takes a real commitment to knowledge translation. And so those would be some of my ideas.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh?
Thank you very much, Mr. Hache. You raised some very good points about this, and I'll have to chip in about, as the liaison on women and gender equity, that's another point that I'll have to raise with staff in terms of where that falls in, because it doesn't seem obvious, but I think you raise a good point about the fact that we can't forget about these things, that it's not just a number crunching. It's all how it fits into the official plan. And do you have any recommendations in terms of specifics on how to outreach to these particular communities?
What was your question, please?
Do you have any recommendations on how to outreach to these specific communities?
We were door knocking yesterday in Councillor Deans's ward in social housing and in co-op housing. We talked to lots of people who don't necessarily think about this stuff all the time, but who, when you engage in conversation with them, they are interested, and they have actually quite a lot to offer to the conversation. Part of I guess the biggest challenge is just getting out from behind your desk and knocking on doors. And I know that that takes time and energy and resources, but I think that being intentional about that and doing that work is fundamental to creating a city for all people. So perhaps the city could collaborate with existing organizations that are doing some of this work to bring information to them, to meet with them in their neighborhoods, at their community centers, for example. And we have found going to things that are already happening and asking for time on their agendas is a useful thing, because people are already gathering at monthly or weekly activities through their volunteerism or what have you. And so doing that in a very focused way is very important. And we've had very good conversations with Charmaine in recent weeks about doing that related to the official plan, and because the development charges is so fundamental to so much of the city's finances, I think it needs to be done with regard to this as well.
Thank you. I'm just curious what kind of questions you ask at a door on development charges.
That's totally off topic, and I'd like to stay focused on development charges, but you could take that offside to ask him what questions.
What kind of questions you ask about development charges.
I don't know that he said he was asking about development charges. I think I don't think he was talking about development charges at the doors. I don't think that's what he meant. Was that what you meant?
That's correct. And what I was saying is that I think if we were to think creatively, we could talk to people about development charges at the doors, but we weren't yesterday particularly. But we were talking about things that are related to transportation and equity, and it touches on all this stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much for coming out. Doug Thompson's up next. I don't want anybody to think that we don't do a lot of community public consultation of all kinds in this city. In fact, recently I received an email which I just forwarded to Ms. Forgy about from, where was that one from? Strathcona, was it? Strathcona, saying, I'm at Association of Municipalities of Ontario. I hear the fabulous work that Ottawa does when it comes to community outreach, whether it's on a particular planning application, whether it's on any of your plans, how you consult online, how you consult on purpose, how you, in person, how you actually engage people in so many different ways. And so I don't want anybody to think that we're not doing that. And again, I go back to the fact that is it logical I guess the logical part is making sure we have the money for all the plans we've already engaged on. That's the difference about what we're talking about today. And, you know, with regard to growth paying growth, Kevin Wary's here in the audience, and he and I were the project managers, if you will, of the Minto Rec Center. 93% of the money for Minto Rec was paid for by development in the suburbs. 93%. And it's certainly not used only by people that live in Barrhaven. Okay, that's the way those things work. So we decide, and I'm not trying to be on a soapbox, but I think it's important to say based on, you know, just some of the things that we're hearing. We decide, and after people come and tell us, all kinds of people, and yes, including developers, they get a say too. They live in this city, they build the city, they invest money here, but all the people that contribute and take the time, and we're constantly trying to think up ways, and we were just the other day on the ice surface sponsor group that we're going to be working on. How can we outreach the most that we can? How can we get to people that aren't engaged because they don't, you know, they don't play hockey, they don't play ringette, they're not figure skaters and stuff like that, but we know that it matters in communities. How do we do more of that beyond going to FCA, beyond going to all of our important associations? So we're constantly looking, always looking for ideas on how to do that better, and Trevor, you've given us a couple. Well, thanks very much for that. Doug, you're here. You told me you didn't really need to speak, but I told you I wanted you to speak. So
you're not trying to embarrass me or make me nervous. Anyway, Madam Chair and members of the committee, I'm here representing the Metcalfe Fair, and I guess indirectly the other rural fairs, Carp, Navan, and Richmond. Metcalfe Fair, and I hope Councillor Moffat is listening, is probably the best fair in all of Ottawa. I just wanted to...
Point of order, point of order. That's a point of privilege. That's a point of privilege.
Don't cut into his 5 minutes, please.
The recommendations here, I've worked with Gary Baker indirectly and directly, I guess, through emails, and we're very pleased that buildings on agriculture, by agricultural societies on agricultural lands are going to be exempt. We have been thinking that this should have happened a number of years ago. I think it's fair, and so we're very pleased that this is part of the development charges bylaw. And as I said, the fair and the other rural fairs are in support of this. So I'm just here to thank the city staff for their work on this and listening to our concerns, and hopefully it passes on the 22nd as it's outlined here.
Well, thanks, Doug, and you know, I don't think anybody can outdo us in Canada probably for the fairs that we have. And one of the great good fortunes we have of 82% of our landmass being rural, agricultural. I mean, it's a terrific, you know that you're getting closer to fall when the first fair is announced.
Yes, and they save, as they say, they save the best for last, and Metcalfe is the last rural fair. So.
You know what? From the first time you ever sat around a council table and you had that hat, and I thought, why would Osgood Township, why would they have a fish on the emblem of their coat of arms? He always wore those crazy hats, eh?
It was a beaver.
Well, there you go. I thought they all lived in Canada. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out, Doug. Next up, we have Kevin Yemm, who originally Pierre Dufresne was going to be speaking on behalf of GOBA, but Pierre had to leave, so Kevin's filling in to speak on behalf of GOBA. Welcome, Kevin.
Surprise for me to fill in this morning for Pierre Dufresne, and I'm happy to bring a happy message from GOBA. Just a couple of talking points. First of all, I wanted to thank Steve Willis and staff for the great dialogue. We did, as mentioned earlier from a previous presenter, that we did have several meetings, very responsive to our concerns. I really appreciate that. And I do realize that came from direction from council, so very, very happy to hear that. One of the things that we were happy to see was a discussion about apartment affordability in the inner city. with regards to higher density. It's time to talk about that, and we're very pleased. GOBA did submit a letter to the committee and to staff highlighting some concerns that we would think that would be unresolved to this point. I know there was a response done this morning. I haven't really gone through that with GOBA, but I heard that it was well received. In particular, some issues remaining with parks, intersection issues that I think that we can resolve before the May 22nd council date. There are probably going to be a couple of meetings with staff, maybe on some specifics that came out in the report, and Steve has assured me that we will be meeting to discuss those. So again, very positive from GOBA. We haven't seen some proposed motions that were brought forward by GOBA and the developer groups in regards to transition clauses, and what we've seen so far that's been drafted, we're very supportive of. So that's all I have to say. And again, like I said, I'm very happy to come up here and say all these positive things. Okay.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Councillor Leeper.
Kevin, what are those outstanding issues that you're hoping, what changes would you be seeking to the DC bylaw before we go to council on May 22nd?
I'm not going to get into the list of the details, but in general, there are some concerns with the calculations for whether we're paying post-period or existing benefit to some of the urban parks.
Okay.
So that's an ongoing discussion. I haven't been personally involved with it. One of our subcommittees has been involved with staff. And then also there were some concerns of the definitions of intersections and what is transitionary or temporary versus phased works.
Okay. If GOBA were to achieve the outcome that it's seeking, would that result in a net reduction to DCs?
I'm not aware if it would, okay, but there is the potential, yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. We don't have on file a letter from GOBA on this topic. Do you have it on file? Do you have it?
Chair, the letter was actually received this morning and it was addressed through to us. It was, I believe, sent to the committee clerk as well this morning. But if not, we'll make sure.
I thought I had seen it.
We'll make sure we transmit it to council.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next up we have Rob Barnes. Rob, are you here? Welcome. Rob's with Ecology Ottawa. Thanks for coming out. You have 5 minutes, and if you can just press the button when you're ready to go.
Good morning, councillors. Good morning, Chair. Happy to be here today on behalf of Ecology Ottawa. As you may know, Ecology Ottawa is a grassroots environmental organization working across a range of issues. And when we look at the issues that we work on for the city, we classify them into 3 buckets. We have active transportation, we have trees, water, and green space, so the living city. And finally, we have action on climate change and renewable energy. And when I think about development charges and the larger conversations around how our city is built, all 3 of these areas are covered. We're concerned with, the urban boundary, green space protection, transit, climate change. All of these things are obviously interlinked in many incredibly complex ways. And so for that reason, we're interested in this discussion, and in fact we joined with Healthy Transportation Coalition, the Federation of Citizens Associations, and the Green Space Alliance of Canada's capital to submit a joint letter to the committee for your consideration. The gist, I think, of the letter is pretty clear, and obviously Trevor spoke a lot about that earlier. Overall, and I think I'll echo Trevor's point to Madam Chair, we were in the room as well when you said about the official plan. I wish the city would get excited about this. You know, there's more excitement about some horse, you know, on top of a restaurant or some structure on top of a restaurant than there is on the official plan. And obviously that's a challenge for all of us, right? And it's a challenge for a group like Ecology Ottawa that seeks to engage the grassroots, the citizenry in these discussions. And so, you know, we want to get development charges right, and that's the spirit of the letter. And so Trevor read the first part of the letter, and I just want to finish it. And it raises obviously some concerns, some issues, but there are a lot of questions, I think, associated with the letter that we still don't have answers to. We're really at the beginning stages of this conversation, and so we hope this continues upon a review. And so there's an ask at the end about opening the process up a little bit more. So I'll continue the letter. The city is too accommodating to the development industry. In 2015, forced to adjust the development charges because of a change in legislation, it struck a deal with the development industry to apply a 25% discount on road costs and delay the inclusion of new transit projects. A real reduction in road costs did not materialize, and there was significant loss in DC revenues as a result. Any delay or failure to include the real cost comes at the expense of the property taxpayer, who has to make up the difference. By not recognizing that growth costs within areas inside the Greenbelt and between suburban areas vary significantly, an opportunity to nudge the industry towards more efficient patterns of development is foregone. An equitable allocation of the cost of growth would help rebalance the incentives for expanding the urban boundary. We've identified about a dozen additional questions or issues which, if the city had acted more transparently and had held proper consultations earlier, could have been discussed or clarified. And so we ask that the city commit to amending the 2019 DC bylaw as soon as the transportation and infrastructure master plans are finalized, presumably in 2021 or 2022, and that it conduct the review in an open and transparent manner involving all stakeholders and using plain language. Thank you very much.
Mr. Willis, did you have any feedback you wanted to say on that at all?
Chair, I think the most important thing to recognize right now is that decision in 2015 is reversed in this new bylaw. There is no longer a deduction of 25%. It was the first thing we did, and this is something we did indicate in our community consultations. So now we are applying the maximum charge we can under law that we feel we can defend to recover costs, and as I indicated earlier, what we're not applying, the costs we're not applying, are those statutory deductions that we're not allowed to apply. So I can give some assurances, and the discussions we've had with the development community are only really are you really going to build this during this period of time? And so therefore, is it applicable and legal to apply that charge at this period of time? And also the issue of transition. And on the transition negotiations, we did something very creative in that we staggered transition to help certain building types, particularly purpose-built rental housing and affordable housing, as well as other more complex intensification-oriented housing, so they would have a later transition, but there is no loss to taxpayers because the cost of that transition has been applied to the overall charge and spread over everyone, so that we were creative and tried to ensure that we promoted those forms of intensification. If council wished to go further on incentivizing, you would have to do that through a different process, through a community improvement plan. You could not do it under the Development Charges Act.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rob, for coming out. Our last speaker today, last delegation, before we come into committee, is Sheila Parry. Sheila? Definitely not your first rodeo, that's for sure. Welcome. I said it's not your first rodeo here, that's for sure.
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm here on behalf of the FCA, the Federation of Citizens Association. And as many of you know, we're a growing organization supporting neighborhoods, and that's really our mantra, supporting neighborhoods in Ottawa. And we have this conversation regularly with staff. It's extremely important, and I think we have a very strong agreement on that regard. So, regarding our DCs and all, and a little bit about FCA, we have our planning group, which it meets monthly. We look at all sorts of issues. Last night we met looking at issues around Bill 108. We're all grappling with that, and that will have some change for us. We also pride ourselves in collaborating with other groups. So this letter going forward to you, which is coming from Green Space Alliance, the Transportation Coalition, And ourselves, this is really important, and Ecology Ottawa, so that we have partnered with common issues of concern. And the whole notion around this is the fairness. We realize many people will glaze over with development charges. It is a complicated process. And we also are aware that there is, through the city, a training program on this whole regard. So those things being considered, our big ask is really looking at having this transparent process continue. It needs to be brought aboard, and also a working group. So we've had this discussion briefly with Mr. Willis, and I just want to highlight some of the aspects for public opportunity or consideration. So part of this is an open public debate that would include whether certain capital projects are a cost of growth that new development in all of the city should pay for, or only fall on certain parts. That includes arterial roads, et cetera, in suburbs. To what extent certain capital projects benefit existing settlements. To what extent geographical differences in the cost of growth should be recognized, i.e. laying pipes, the cost in the east, south, west, and obviously that changes if there's growth on the outer areas. How the settling of development charges can be better used to nudge new development in directions that are least costly and most efficient. And we're seeing that obviously with the involvement, and we are involved with the official plan. This is including GOBA and BOMA. And where are these opportunities for intensification that make sense, that aren't going to overload areas? As we spread further, the costs, obviously, or there's obligations on the part of the city. So I guess in summary, and as I mentioned, the collaborative effort to us is extremely important in this. We see this as ongoing. The idea of having the discussion with the city involving the various groups is really important to us. And we know that with Bill 108, this is a transition and an opportunity, and DCs are extremely important for our city. So can we have a working group? Can we move in that direction in a very good collaborative fashion? Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And I would add that all of you, so I know that Trevor was involved for sure. I know that you were involved in Beyond 2036 as well. So, you know, I'm always looking for ideas. Our staff are always, Charmaine is the queen of community outreach. If you have other ideas, in fact, I am interested in, Trevor, what you were talking to people at the doors about, okay? Because not everybody, many people have access to this. Our library system is the only free thing that there is in this city, and you can access information there. But are there some other ways that we can still speak to more people? Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll come in to committee, and I think what we should do is have the motions read that we have before us, so that everybody's on the same page with that before we get into questions and any presentations and that sort of thing. So start with the marijuana one. Marijuana.
Let's not call it that anymore, Jan. All right.
That's why you're here to do your big job today.
Where it's now proposed that the term marijuana production facility in the zoning bylaw be replaced with the term cannabis production facility, therefore be resolved that the term marijuana production facility in the draft development charge bylaw be replaced with cannabis production facility.
Okay, so I think, can we all agree to that one right now so we don't have to go back and say it again? For me, it'll always be marijuana, even though I didn't use it, but still, just it's an age thing, I think. Next up is the one on complete buildings. And we're going to ask Mr. Mark to explain what that means too, once he introduces it.
Thank you. Whereas the report, 2019 Development Charges Background Studies and Bylaws, details the revised development charges, background studies, and bylaws to include document 5, transition policy provisions, agreements, definitions, charges, and whereas under the definition of the complete building permit application refers to the registered site plan, whereas the definition is to be amended to refer to the approved site plan. Therefore, be resolved that the Planning Committee recommend to Council that the definition of the complete building permit application in both the report and the bylaw be replaced with the following. Complete building permit application means the building permit application meeting the submission requirements outlined in the bylaw 2014-220 received by the June 28th will be eligible for the transition provided that there is an approved site plan or subdivision.
Mr. Mark?
Madam Chair, the original language that was in the draft bylaw circulated 2 weeks ago required that for someone to be eligible for transition, they would have had to sign the site plan agreement or the subdivision agreement by June 28th. This, of course, will create a pressure for agreements it may not be possible to achieve, and therefore staff have agreed to make reference to the site plan approval or subdivision approval, which will provide a little bit wider scope for eligibility for transition.
For clarification on how that isn't a benefit just to the developer, Mr. Willis?
So quickly, we're also trying to address the surge in applications in our Building Code Services group that would be created by that, and it's also a matter of ease of administration. This is a far easier clause to administer, and as I indicated, because the costs of transition are applied to the overall cost, there is no cost to taxpayer with making this change.
And we all are cognizant of the pressure that our building services people are going to be under with regard to the flooding and the massive amount of work. I forget what Mr. Badin said, that the pressure in staffing to him was 26 or something like that. Am I remembering right?
As we stand, as of a report I read yesterday, our application counts up 26% over last year. And we're soon going to be in an emergency response rebuilding mode as well. So I just, we've taken a lot of steps in the last year to ease policy decisions like this effect on the delivery of service, and this eases delivery of service.
And I think that Ms. Snedden told us that the applications in January and February were up 90% or something over the previous year. And so Mr. James is Leanne of today. So you haven't added any staff for that either?
No, Madam Chair. The staff, our staff contingent is the same as it has been for the years now. So we're dealing with what we have. Yeah.
Perfect. I think that was important so that this wasn't seen as one-sided. Councillor Blais? Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question on transition. And it was interesting when you showed the graphic on the spike at the date change for when the fee changes happen. Have we ever reviewed spreading the fee changes over incrementally across the year to drag, so that the result would be the same from a revenue perspective, but it would ease the process internally and presumably for the industry as well?
Chair, I thank the council for that question. In fact, that's actually what we've done in this bylaw for the very first time. In the past, we drop a transition date. Everybody would know when it would be because we have to give advance notice of it, and all the surge would happen. What we did is we divided the building permit applications into low-rise, wood frame construction, have a standard transition the same as we've done in previous years, but high-rise development, purpose-built rental units, regardless of their size, get a later date of transition. So we're breaking it into two chunks to spread out the effect, as you suggested. I think this will be meaningful. We'll look and see how this goes, and then if this has the right effect, then the next time maybe we'll look at going further with that idea.
Okay. All right. On that motion, on the complete buildings? Carried. All right. So next up, Vice Chair? Main Street, I think.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Whereas on January 27, 2016, City Council endorsed that the lands of 175 Main Street, the former Roadblades property, Schedule R attached, and the former Rockcliffe Airbase, Schedule S attached, would be removed from the land subject to the park parks component of the development charges, whereas the Ontario Municipal Board approved the modification by order dated February 17, 2016, whereas through inadvertent modification was not carried forward into the draft development charges bylaw, therefore be resolved that the draft bylaw be amended by including the following provision to subsection 5.7. 5.7, in respect to the land shown in Schedule R and S, that the parks development component of the development charge imposed by the bylaw shall not be payable. Be it further resolved that the bylaw be further amended by adding Schedules R and S attached within this motion.
So just so you know, I mean, it may sound to the people in the urban area that somebody's going to get really lucky here, but absolutely, it's they have the same sort of agreement that all of our developers now have in the suburban areas, where they're not paying for a development charge for the parks because they're actually they're building the parks and paying for them, and consequently, we're getting our parks built a lot faster because of that. So, Councillor Menard. Well, Councillor Moffat's giving you room. You know, but just as an aside, maybe, Ms. Stephanie, maybe when we have like a citywide important policy, we should have like a roving mic over on that table. Go ahead.
It's a good idea. Thanks very much, Chair. I just have a quick question about this. I think I understand what it's trying to do. In the budget, we had some money, though, allocated to that park. Specifically, it was, I think, 1.2 million. Can you just relate to me how that coincides with this? I think that money was there as a result of the previous decision in 2016. And I just want to make sure that how that works now with this motion.
Kevin Wary is going to respond.
Sorry, Councillor Menard, could you just repeat the last bit? I was walking.
Sure. So in this last budget, we had some money allocated to that park portion within those oblate lands. I think to the amount of $1.2 million. And I just want to know the relationship between the motion that's now on the floor and that money that's already been allocated in our budget. I think there's some relationship there.
Madam Chair, I'm not certain if he's referring to the 2019 capital budget for Recreation, Culture and Facility Services, or if it's on the Regional Highlights document that was circulated along with the budget. The Regional Highlights document demonstrates a community benefit arriving that was developer built to the tune of $1.2 million.
Okay, and then just clarification on what this motion is doing then. We're saying they're not going to be paying DC charges as a result of this motion, but that in the future they will be. I want to just be really clear on what it's trying to accomplish, and that may be more a question for Mr. Willis.
I'll start off, Madam Chair. What it means is that, as Chair Harder said, they are treated as the same way as suburban parks, and in the outside the Greenbelt area, the developers do not pay a development charge for neighborhood or community parks. They do pay a development charge for district parks. However, the developers have to build the parks themselves. And so it was determined by council in consultation with Canada Lands for Rockcliffe and with the regional group for 175 Main that they wish to be treated in 2016 as suburban parks. And quite frankly, what happened, Madam Chair, is when I was drafting the bylaw, I went through the past bylaws to be certain I picked up everything. I didn't go through board orders. I missed it, and that's why a motion is now needed to reinstate what council had approved in 2016.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so on this motion, carried? Okay. Next up, Vice Chair Tierney on the non-residential category.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Whereas prior to the just a bit of a typo. Whereas prior to the 2014 development charges bylaw and non-residential category was divided into industrial, commercial, institutional, and retail uses, and whereas the 2014 bylaw non-residential category was divided into industrial and non-industrial uses, Whereas in consultation in respect to the 2019 development charges review, the city has been requested to review whether it would be appropriate to return to the pre-2014 approach. Therefore, be resolved that the General Manager, Planning and Infrastructure and Economic Development be directed to review the categories in which the non-residential lands are divided in the development charge purposes to submit a recommendation to the committee and council no later than the first quarter 2020.
This is a direction, and it's pushed out to the first quarter of 2020. Anybody have any questions about it, or is it carried? Carried? Thank you. Next up is Councillor Blake on the direction to staff to review roads, etc. Want me to hand you a hard copy? Okay.
Whereas part of the determination of development charges for roads and related services, a determination must be made as to the division of growth between residential and non-residential uses, and whereas this split may be affected as a result of the use of the Confederation line, and whereas the city is conducting a review of the Transportation Master Plan, therefore be it resolved that the General Manager of Transportation Services and the General Manager Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development be directed as part of the review of the TMP, be directed to, it says revision, by that I mean reimagine the division of growth as it relates to the roads and related services component of the DC charge bylaw.
You want to just explain that a little bit, since it's your motion?
Stand to correct me, please, Mr. Willis, but in our discussion, there had been some a viewpoint that there should be a division in how certain things are calculated inside and outside the Greenbelt, as an example, which makes perfect sense from a certain point of view, and that, but at the same time, with the extension of the Confederation line outside the Greenbelt, using the Confederation line as that demarcation point for that conversation might make more sense, and this is asking staff to go off and think about that and present us with their recommendation.
Okay.
Does that summarize our conversation? Yeah.
Good? Carried? You have to say it, actually. I can't just say it. Carried? Thank you. I mean, I'd like it to be that way, but, you know, that's not the kind of city we're running. Okay, next up, the next couple ups are Councillor Leeper, I think, on behalf of Councillor Fleury. Councillor Leeper?
Thanks, Chair, and yes, these are on behalf of Councillor Fleury. So the first motion, and I'll ask Councillor Fleury to address it, is with respect to directing development charges to specific urban recreation facilities. The motion is, whereas the report details the revised development charges, background studies, and bylaws, and whereas there are currently no methods by which to direct development charges to specific urban recreational facilities in order to upgrade older facilities, therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Council to direct staff to review methods of increasing the amount of development charges that can be allotted to urban recreational facility upgrades or expansion, taking into account the anticipated legislation changes as a result of Bill 108.
So I'm going to ask Councillor Fleury to speak to that, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Willis to make a comment, or Mr. Mark, whichever you prefer.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Members of committee, this is really, as you know, you're going to see a DC review later this term, and it's really to ask staff to review this component. As you know, and we're proud that the city has built in various communities. When I look at the Richcraft, the Minto, the François Dupuis, these have been great additions to those neighborhoods. And in various parts of the core, we are holding on to centennial facilities and haven't seen those expanded. So just giving some tools to the city to review it as part of the next phase of the DC efforts.
Can we support that direction? Councillor Dudas?
Just a quick question for Councillor Fleury. I see it says allotted to urban recreational facility upgrades. I have a number of older facility, well, actually Matt Luloff has a number in his ward right on adjacent to mine. Would that also encompass suburban ones as well?
Chair, may I answer on Councillor Fleury's behalf? I think that would be a reasonable inclusion, older recreational facilities. Just quickly, legislation limits us. We cannot use it for renewal of facilities, but if we can calculate that there is growth, and growth is driving a certain need in these areas, and this is all linked to the updated recreation master planning work that RCFS is doing, so timing is very good for this motion, and that's why staff support it.
As an example, many years ago now, when we were going to, I guess when I was the chair of the Ottawa Public Library, we, wrestling with development charges that are for growth, how do you take part of those development charges and assign them to a downtown central library? Okay, so this is kind of like a next step. We worked with that, with the rules, and the rules may be changing, so, okay? So on this direction?
Madam Chair, so will the wording be changed to just say older buildings, or is it going to stay urban?
Chair, if I may suggest, Councillor Leeper, I don't move amendments. Well, I recommend Councillor Leeper delete the word urban in the second whereas, so it just says specific recreational facilities, which does not then discriminate between urban and suburban, or rural, for that matter.
I consider that friendly.
I'm glad. Okay. So is that carried? Thank you. Next up, Councillor Leeper on increasing rental unit supply. So Leeper,
Thanks, Chair.
Fleury, Mr. Velez.
So whereas the report details revised development charges schedule, and whereas there are currently no initiatives being offered as part of this development charge review in relation to increasing available affordable rental units, and whereas it is important to increase supply of rental units in order to make rentals more available and affordable, therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Council direct staff to review the incentives currently available to encourage the construction of more rental units and report back to Planning Committee, taking into account the anticipated legislation changes as a result of Bill 108.
All right, Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. This is simply, as you know, we've set out a goal to see more rental built, and we have a low vacancy rate right now in our city, so giving ourselves tools so that going forward, staff can look at options. So again, this is for later this term of council, as the DC's review would come back, that staff would consider the range of options that are at hand.
So, and can I just ask you to comment, if you know, Mr. Willis, on the program that Central Mortgage and Housing initiated a couple of years ago that drew interest from a couple of the developers as a way to be able to afford more rental housing. Has that really been taken up, and is that something that we should be promoting or participating in some fashion?
So, Chair, on that question, and then I'll go back to assist Councillor Fleury on his point. We understand there has been take-up in Ottawa, and there are a number of fairly significant projects that are in the pipeline right now that are relying on contributions from CMHC, and they're primarily located in the core where that's actually happening. So we're encouraged. Do think CMHC could do more to make sure people are aware of what's available. Some developers seem to be more aware of it than others. On the issue of the actual motion, why staff are prepared to do this is that it's unlikely we'll come back with a different development charges rate related to this. I'm not sure we can do that under the law. We did in this bylaw slow down the change of rate from old bylaw to new bylaw deliberately for purpose-built rental, but there are tools through community improvement plans that could possibly address the councillors, and we'll kind of give council what could you do if you chose to do it, a set of options, and we'll look at this. And I'll rely on support from my colleagues from Community Social Services, Housing Policy side of this. But Bill 108 does change this considerably, so we'll talk about that later.
Perfect. A question from Councillor Brockington?
Just to piggyback.
Who's the question to?
To Mr.
Okay.
Willis. Just to piggyback on that last statement, I think what I like about this motion is the word incentives, because I think we, the committee, need to be aware of what our options are. So is it more of an information report, or are you actually going to come with recommendations?
Chair, if I'd like to consult my colleagues in community social services who are responsible for the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. I'd like to get their input on the nature of this. I think to a certain extent there may be an interrelationship between that effort and this, and so perhaps, Councillor, if I can, between now and Council, consult them, I can answer your question better.
I'm just wondering if I can also ask, there are other initiatives as well that are going to be at play that maybe not, that won't be linked to DCs per se, but
Give
are
an
still
example.
inclusionary zoning. I think it would be good to make sure we're aware of all the other options that are out there, because I think it will complement your report when it comes. Anyway, just food for thought.
Friendly? Or just, is that friendly, or just you need that? Yes. Okay, it's friendly. Okay, is that friendly addition and the rest of it all carried? Do you understand what that is? Okay. So, okay, we'll get the exact, give that, write down, yeah, the couple of extra words we're adding there. Okay, just as an introduction to the next two motions, first one's being moved by myself, so when I go to move that, I have to step out of the seat, but I'm actually not going to move, but Vice Chair Tierney will be in the seat for the time I introduce it. But, and then there's one by, from Councillor Gower.
And another Fleury motion.
We weren't sure, we didn't have it.
We didn't have it then. Do we have it now? But it's not the only ones. I'm just speaking specifically to area rated. So, you know, speaking of growth paying for growth and communities being built and or not being able to be built within areas that are zoned for high growth, for example, in the Stittsville area and the Barrhaven area, this is what these two speak to. So it's sort of taking an autonomy with the assistance of with the support of the developers in each of the communities, where they agree, as was the case in Riverside South, in order to get the extension of the Bowesville line into Riverside South. Right, so the developers there are paying an area specific. It in no way takes away from any of the development charges that are also captured from the same developments across the city that benefit the list that we have. What it does is when the turn comes up for the list, okay, you have, that community has actually paid extra money in order to allow what's necessary. Councillor Leap, are looking at me like I'm on drugs or something, but I'm not. But you've been out and you've seen that bridge. You've been on that bridge in the winter, the Greenbank Bridge. So I'm going to step out of this is the reason for I'm not moving. You're now the chair, so I'm going to introduce my motion. So this is an area-specific charge for Greenbank Road realignment. It's moved by myself. Whereas the Greenbank Road realignment, brackets Chapman Mills to Cambrian, is currently not planned to be implemented until 2030 due to funding limitations and reprioritization of Strandherd Drive as it is functioning as the new Hunt Club and requires a via grade separation. And whereas 35,000 people already living south of the Jock River in homes that were built around the plan to build the community around a large arterial road, which includes bridges, certainly to replace the absolutely terrible one, park and rides, cycling and pedestrian facilities, of which we have none, and rapid transit. Whereas the environmental assessment for the Greenbank Road realignment has been approved, and whereas the Greenbank Road realignment is needed to provide access to new developments in Riverside in Barrhaven South, whereas developers in Barrhaven South have expressed an interest in working with the city to examine alternative funding solutions, therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Council to direct the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development to complete a background study and bring forward an amendment to the DC bylaw to introduce an area-specific charge for Barrhaven to accelerate the Greenbank Road alignment and related works. As I said, there's 35,000 people that live around a vast corridor, and now what's happening is we're having to invest millions of dollars in repairing that rickety bridge, which is ridiculous, and no cycling facilities, no pedestrian facilities, no retail, because we lost the retail without having that road too. So the people can't even walk to the closest retail, which is on the north side of the Jock River at Strandherd. I mean, and Minto Rec is right there. It's just like ridiculous. So this is the only way that we can figure to move it forward, because all of the money that I had to approve taking that $90 million and moving it to Strandherd. Okay? So now, Councillor, now I'm back in the seat, I guess.
Well, actually, thank you for the introduction of the motion. Is there any questions on this item?
Okay.
Seeing no, Councillor Lieber.
Out of curiosity, so when do you anticipate that background study would be completed?
Very soon.
So Councillor Chair, Deputy Vice Chair, the staff would complete the background study to identify the very specific, and it's a very discrete list of initiatives to be brought forward. This is very much like the Riverside South option, where we have a priority list of transportation improvements, but by building the line further sooner than we would otherwise, we are paying through normal development charges what we would normally pay, and the developer is paying to advance the project, and the incremental difference between those two, and the treasurer's here to help me if I get this wrong, and they're required to pick up those charges to go faster than we would do it if we got to it on our own. And so the background study needs to be created, it needs to be brought forward, we need to bring a bylaw to you, much as we are doing today, you would also have to approve that bylaw. So timing-wise, we're anticipating trying to get this done by the end of 2019.
Okay, wow. And then how is that background study, forgive me, funded? Is that out of reserves?
The actual creation of the background study, we're looking to the developers group to do the heavy lifting of the work, so we don't have to do it ourselves.
Okay, that sounds good. I like that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. Any further questions on this item? Seeing no questions, is this item carried? Great, thank you. Swap seats back. Boom.
Okay, now over to Councillor Gower.
So it's a very similar motion.
Has your own unique situation?
Yeah, similar motion, similar background. We're expecting between now and 2031 over 9,500 new housing units in Stittsville, many of which are along the future Robert Grant Avenue corridor, which serves not only Stittsville, but folks from Canada North, Canada South, and also from Rideau Goulburn. It is not just a road, but also multi-use pathway and a future transit corridor as well. So whereas the Robert Grant Avenue extension from Abbott Street to Palladium Drive is currently not planned to be implemented until beyond the 2031 planning horizon due to funding limitations, and whereas the Robert Grant Avenue extension is needed to provide access to new developments in Stittsville, and whereas developers in Stittsville have expressed an interest in working with the city to examine alternative funding solutions, therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Council to direct the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development to complete a background study and bring forward an amendment to the DC bylaw to introduce an area-specific charge for Stittsville to accelerate the Robert Grant Avenue extension and related improvements to Huntmar Drive.
You want him to say the same thing? It's basically the same thing.
Can I please repeat the question?
Well, he'd say the same thing. It's the
Same questions.
question
What is the timing, and then how do we expect
How are
it
you
to be
gonna afford
funded?
it?
So,
Who's gonna pay
Chair,
it?
this one is not as far advanced as the earlier one, and the discussions are only very initial, so I wouldn't imagine it's exactly on the same timeline, but I would imagine that we would be trying to do this in the next year and a bit, but all the same answers otherwise.
So 2020 and then funded by the developers themselves?
That's right, and we would again have to bring forward the background study, we would have to bring forward a bylaw, you would have to approve the bylaw.
Yep. Thank you, Chair.
You are welcome. Yes?
I'll just note on the screen, the motion needs to be slightly amended to be Robert Grant Avenue rather than Boulevard to match our street naming, so.
Okay.
I'd actually probably really quickly rename a street that name and make sure that funding comes to me instead.
Okay, so that's what the ward boundaries are all about and the changes we will make there. Is this carried? Thank you. I can hardly wait for that one. Bring it on. Okay, so So, Mr. Lieber, Councillor Lieber, do you have a copy of this other one that I now have before me on dwelling rooms?
I do, thank you, Chair. And this is another one on behalf of Councillor Fleury with respect to the development charge rate for dwelling rooms, whereas it is appropriate that rooming units are subject to the same development charge rate as bachelor or one-bedroom apartments. Therefore, be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend that Council that the draft development charge bylaw be amended such that dwelling rooms subject to the provisions of 4 subsection 3 to 4 subsection 7, grandparenting of projects with site plan approval, nursing homes and similar development buildings which contain 3 or more residential units, where each unit has a single entrance and contains between not less than 2 but no more than 4 bedrooms, pay the rate established for an apartment with less than 2 bedrooms.
Well, before we go to you, I just want to ask the question that's burning on everyone's mind. Mr. Mark, is this legal?
Madam Chair, I'm going to choose to expand your question a little bit. Is it defensible? Is it legal? Yes, council can probably enact it. Is it defensible? In my opinion, it will be a challenge. So what is being done, and I'll try to give some numbers around this, it may help. What's being done in this bylaw is, as Mr. Willis indicated, we're going from charging dwelling rooms, essentially rooming units, from a 1/4 the single rate, which is about $7,800, to a 1 person per unit rate, which is around $9,000 and a bit. This motion would make the rooming units subject to the less than 2 bedroom apartment rate, which is around $11,000, so a further $2,000 increase or so. The rooming unit rate is based on 1 person per unit. Staff believe that is defensible. The less than 2 bedroom rate is based on an average of 1.4 persons per unit. In staff's view, it is unlikely that you would see a mix of 1 and 2 persons in rooming units. You're going to see 1, and therefore staff have concerns as to the defensibility of it.
Councillor Fleury?
I want to thank staff for helping me draft this motion, and maybe I can set out the context for colleagues. We've been very consistent in closing loopholes, specifically when it's targeting bunkhouses. So I recognize what staff have done. In my mind, they've gone halfway. We really need to close that incentive loophole. I'll give you, and I'll ask Mr. Mark, I'd asked yesterday to prepare some analysis for one property, and that's 256 Rideau. 256 Rideau is a purpose-built student accommodation, and the city, it's a 20-something story building, of which we should have collected millions of dollars more than we could in DCs if this incentive was closed. So maybe, Mr. Mark, if you could highlight what we would have collected if it was dwelling units charges versus what we were able to collect in the end with the rooming units.
Madam Chair, first of all, I want to thank the council for providing the question in advance so that it didn't have to be done, the math done on the fly. So under the rate in the current bylaw, so treating it as a nursing home, and I'm just going to round up to the next highest 100,000, it would have been 4.4 million. Under the rooming rate, dwelling rate that staff are proposing, it would be 5.3 million, and if it was charged a 1-bedroom apartment rate, it would be 6.9 million.
So I just want to make sure that as part of development, if someone
I've
has...
got that song, Money, 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 running through my head right now.
I just want to make sure that developers aren't using it as an incentive to go to what I believe to be a less desirable option. We want that they'd be 1-bedrooms or bachelors, that each unit has their washroom and their kitchens, and that they'd be charged appropriately, and that's what the definition of dwelling units captures. So by creating a financial disproportion, we incentivize we incentivize a weird loophole. So in this context, you have a 20-story rooming house that's being built on Rideau Street, and we're trying to create, and we're getting less charges for it. In the end, it's going to cost us more money from Bylaw Services and other agencies to monitor situations there. And again, just with your help, members of committee, we've been able to close a big portion of the loophole for bunkhouses. I want to remain consistent with those efforts.
And nobody is ever going to be able to say that you haven't pulled out every tool, worked with staff to the nth degree in order to make your community better, this part of your community, absolutely. Kudos for everything that you've tried and for the team for being creative and helping you with that. Councillor Brockington, then Councillor Leeper. Questions, you said, I think?
DCs are collected, though, when a structure is to be built or renovated. And in my experience in my ward, with rooming houses or bunks, not as bad as Councillor Fleury, is it happens well after a home has been built. And so if you're trying to amend the DC to make it better reflect what the actual use or purposes of the house, to me, do we not have more rooming houses and bunk houses that appear after the fact? Like, how many people are applying to build a rooming house or a bunk house?
So, Chair, first of all, Councillor has a really interesting question. If you look at the provisions of the existing bylaw and the new one, which both deal with it, if you're doing a conversion of one use to another, you pay the difference from your old to your new in terms of what your use is, in terms of bedrooms. Now, Bill 108 will affect that, in that you'll get one for free in Bill 108. But that's how we apply it today on any conversions. Councillor Fleury is talking about something that is a little different, and it is about buildings that are being purposely built, not as a traditional apartment building, but clearly in the rooming house category of things, or bunkhouse category. And I will say that the policy side of my brain is very sympathetic to the councillor's position, and we actually did move in this bylaw already to charge a higher rate in what you have before you. What Mr. Mark has pointed out is I would like to give the councillor what he is asking for. We just fear that under appeal, we will have a trouble defending that. But as I said, I'm sympathetic to the position the councillor's taking.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm inclined to support this, but the economist in me is worried about the cost of having to defend this repeatedly versus any incremental additional revenue the corporation might receive by implementing the change. And so I think the right thing to do is actually do this, but if we feel that, you know, we're going to rack up huge legal bills because it's legally not defensible, then I do think that has to be weighed into our decision making as well.
I'm going to Councillor Leeper, then Councillor Hubley.
So Matt, we all want to support you in controlling the bunkhouse phenomenon in those buildings that are creating a lot of property standards and bylaw calls, et cetera, et cetera. What is going to be the effect, though, of restricting or disincenting further student housing where student housing is needed? Should we be treating a larger professionally managed apartment building the same as a bunkhouse?
To me, it's less so the student component. It's understanding, and when I sat down with Mr. Baker and Charmaine and Tim Mark a while back, and we had a deep dive into why was there a difference between dwelling units versus rooming units. And if you dig deep, the intent of the rooming units, and Mr. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the intent is really focused on retirement residence, where in a retirement residence, the senior might not need a kitchen in each of their units. They might have a cafeteria, for example. Yeah. And that's where the clause came from, and now staff are specifying that. What's happening, though, is that current division has allowed certain developers to leverage it to pay less DCs and to make the units less flexible by not offering kitchens, by not offering a washroom for each bedrooms or units, if you will. So I'm just trying to not to close that loophole. I'm not trying to not incentivize its main purpose, which was always for retirement residences.
Okay. Maybe I could hear from staff, like, to what extent could this serve as a disincentive to building a housing type that is needed in the city?
Certainly in the consultations leading up to this bylaw, regardless of this issue, we had a concern raised related to purpose-built rental, and purpose-built rental is happening in Ottawa now after many years of it not happening.
Yep.
And a lot of the developers would tell you that their margins are quite limited on it in the course of developing the property, and that they were concerned about our transition clauses actually killing projects that were in process, which is why, in order to ensure that we continue to support a rental housing stock, which Council has repeatedly said we're trying to do, we lengthen the transition period to that purpose. So I am cognizant of a potential risk, and that's why we think we found the moderate balance. I don't disagree with the councillor on the issues. I think the staff recommendation is that fine balance. It's legally defendable. It doesn't, it's about a 25% increase as opposed to what the councillor would propose, which is substantially more than that. It removes the improper application, unfair, that they were getting away with paying with less.
Okay.
So it brings it fair. We think we've hit the happy medium.
Okay.
With no disrespect to what the council's.
Thanks, Chair.
So Councillor Kubley and then Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I share the concerns that my colleagues are suggesting here, and I'm wondering, Mr. Willis, if it would be possible that if we support the motion that's before us to bump it up to 25%, I think there's consensus around the table to do that, then you'll collect that off of anything coming forward. Is it possible, because we're going to do another DC bylaw in this term, is it possible to take a look at these units and see if they are one person per unit, or is there a significant amount that they're putting two people in there per unit, so that Councillor Fleury's motion would be more defensible for Mr. Mark? Would that be possible?
Chair, I can say that leading up to this bylaw, our research and forecasting staff did drill down on Stats Canada data, and that's how we get that typical one-bedrooms and apartments are 1.4 persons per unit. That is actually real Stats Canada data, which is because you have some single people and you have some couples living in those apartments, and that's why it ends up as 1.4. The bunk houses, the way they're the rooming houses, the way they're physically designed, these rooms aren't big enough to put more than one single bed in them, the way we're seeing in the building permit information. So we'll continue to monitor that, but I think we're founded on solid logic if we're under appeal based on both a review of the building permit information we've had and the Stats Canada data.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to let Councillor Fleury kind of wrap up on it, but Councillor Brockington is likely going to move a referral to council, just so that you have a chance to give us some more detail based on all the questions that we've had between now and then. And I have a question on the 22-story one that you talked about, that's basically how many units of rooming houses. If it had a different definition than lumped into nursing homes, where there's a presumption that you all go to a cafeteria, wouldn't there be different costs, higher costs from fire standards and that as far as the building goes? I guess I should look at you, Richard.
Without knowing too much of the specifics there, no, basically, you're dealing with units, you're looking at fire separations, sprinklers for both.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brockington, then Councillor Fleury. Well, we're not going to vote on it. You just say that you're going to do it.
Okay, well, yeah, Madam Chair, given the information we've heard from staff today, I think we understand Councillor Fleury's intent and some caution that staff are suggesting today that we take under advisement. I would suggest that rather than take a vote today, we refer the matter directly to council, and in the interim, staff get back to all members of council in writing with concerns about the defensibility of what's being asked, and if there are any other suggestions to improve the motion from Councillor Fleury to make it more defensible, then that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Before we vote on that referral, I'm going to go back to Councillor Fleury for his wrap-up.
So just on a wrap-up, I want to thank the team here for working with me on this, and want to thank committee also for the strong consideration. I think I recognize the staff position was already a really good step. I just want to close that incentive completely, and I want to share with committee that we don't see this from the majority of large and small developers. This is a small niche group that just doesn't want to pay what they should be paying in DCs, and in the end we have less desirable units, or units that don't offer the diversity that we'd be looking for. So, I would, if we were to be appealed, I would certainly support today's staff position, but I would be surprised to see an appeal relating to this. And I did speak to members of GOBA who are supportive of closing that incentive.
Dave Renfro and people like that. Perfect, thank you. So on referral of this one motion to council on the 22nd, 22nd? Carried? Okay, then now we're going to, thank you, Councillor Fleury. Now we're going to go to Vice Chair Tierney for, to kind of like bring it all together.
Great. Be it resolved that pursuant to the Development Charges Act, subsection 12.3, Planning Committee recommends to Council that further public meeting is not necessary.
Item carried. And on the, okay. Councillor Leeper has a question for staff.
Now that we're addressing the larger development charge bylaw at this point.
Well, sure, if you want to.
So
I thought that's what we've been doing, but
I thought.
Go ahead.
Okay, so with respect to, we're doing a lightning round of development charge bylaw right now. We're applying the same paradigms to the existing, to the new bylaw as we have for the previous one. What is the timing for the creation of a newer development charge bylaw that takes into account an updated transportation master plan, infrastructure master plan, Bill 108 changes, et cetera, et cetera?
So Chair, early last week, that would have been an easier question than it is to answer than it is today. Early last week, before the introduction of Bill 108, I would have said the answer to that question is towards the last year of this term of council, we would bring forward a new DC bylaw to match, particularly the TMP update, where we know there will be more significant changes and perhaps others. And we have lots of time between now and then if council wishes us to explore certain policy alternatives related to how we do area-specific versus and how we do the division between things. There would be time. Bill 108 likely will force us, we don't have all the details yet, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, will likely force us to bring an amendment to this adopted bylaw before that. Okay. But my advice to council would be, we'll bring a compliance amendment to bring it forward, but let's finish the TMP, because I don't think opening those policy questions separate from the TMP and other elements is really a good use of council's time.
No.
Make a lot of sense.
Well, no, I absolutely agree. So obviously, for the last several years, I've been asking staff to take a look at, some geographic specificity to the bylaw that is different from what we're doing right now, to carve out maybe the urban core from the urban suburbs, from the outer suburbs, from the rural, to take into account very different growth rates. Is that within the scope of a second DC amendment, not including the compliance?
So, Chair, absolutely, it can be, should council direct us so. The history, I asked Mr. Baker for a bit of the history. This current arrangement of the four-tiered geographic tiers has been in place since the former regional municipality of Ottawa Carleton's development charges study, so from 1999, which the amalgamated city of Ottawa adopted shortly after amalgamation and continued on. So given that it's been 20 plus years in operation, by the time we get to it, if council wishes us to go back and look at it, I'm sure some of the analysis we did at the time before is still relevant today, and the pros and cons of changing it there are pros and there are cons, and we could, over the course of the next couple of years, bring you alternatives should council direct us to do so.
Will you come back to council seeking direction for that second round of DC amendments?
We certainly can. I mean, one of the differences this time around is that one of the difficulty with this process is we could not be openly consulting on this process until after the new council was elected, sworn in, and the like. We're required to not consult during that time period, so that's why it's a compressed process. It's also just a rollover bylaw with some tweaks. We have lots of runway right now, and should council wish and desire so, I imagine we take directions through this committee about factors to consider in our next review.
And that's a nice segue to the letter that I think we've all read from Ecology Ottawa, Green Space Alliance, and Healthy Transportation Coalition, seeking a more transparent or more open consultation process. And I think certainly I've got a lot of sympathy for that. We need to balance the fact that DCs are extraordinarily difficult to understand. I'm not sure that every councillor will understand every detail of the DCs that we're approving today, and we are putting ourselves in your hands to some degree. A lot of statutory constraints on what can be done. It's not a pot of money that we can just increase because there are projects that we want to pay for. There's a lot of studies that have to be put into them. But how can we make the consultation process richer with the general public and with stakeholders who are not developers? I have a lot of sympathy for the view of those who have been following this process, who see, a single meeting with FCA leadership and 13 meetings with developers. I don't think that reflects well on the city. How can we make this a better consultation process moving forward?
Are you looking for an answer on that?
I am.
Because I think that my personal opinion is that you should make some suggestions.
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that we have done a fantastic job. And I would say that, as I've said repeatedly through this process, the development charges are about how to pay for all the things that everybody in the city has made priorities, whether it is the FCA, whether it's Ecology Ottawa, whether it's Healthy Transportation. Right. Those are the people that have worked really, really hard on the components that now cause Gary to come up with his equation, his mathematical formula, which is very, very different. And I don't. There's not an opportunity through this process to add new projects.
No, and there's not.
It's about funding the ones that these folks have contributed greatly to.
We have heard, and I've seen through the course of being on the sponsors group for the DC bylaw amendments, that there is discretion that's being applied. There are things that the city is willing to consider in a process of give and take with the development community, particularly as we try to seek a development charges bylaw that isn't going to be appealed. And I think that that's something
that's important too.
We've done very well in this instance. But we've heard the suggestion from the community interest stakeholders who are here to create a stakeholder group that can begin the process of education, learning how development charges work now. So that over the course of 2 years, moving into the end of this term of council, you have a group who can be a sounding board for what the city is thinking.
Sure. And to that end, and this is why Ms. Forgey is sitting where she is, as you know, we excel at our planning primers. Not many places are doing that. Not only that, we've added other ones. Added as Sheila, in her role with the FCA, has asked over the years. Remember the Committee of Adjustment? Remember, we came forward. So on this one, great recommendation. Certainly that's something that you should take forward and have a primer on development charges, right? So that people can learn if that makes sense and if there's a desire. But on top of that, I think that when we get into the next topic, the Bill 108 and what that may or may not mean, then that's going to be a discussion that absolutely is going to be a public discussion.
But Chair, I'm looking beyond a planning primer or a resource by which people can learn how development charges work in the actual creation of a working group that has time to get up to speed on what development charges are and can be a sounding board through the process of creating maybe the compliance update, our 1B update isn't necessarily the right one, but moving into
Let's let them
a more
think
fundamental.
About it. Mr. Willis?
Yeah.
Just really quickly, after we got the letter, I have to admit I was taken aback by the letter when we got it, but criticism is comes with the territory sometimes. And I phoned Ms. Parry right away and said, okay, what could we have done differently? We did provide the meeting that we did have with them. Mr. Baker responded to numerous emails with follow-up information, with questions that came forth. So it was more than one connection point on it. We had the information online. It is a tough topic. So the conversation I had with Ms. Parry, which was really useful, and I'm really grateful that she took the time to talk to me about it, is we've discussed the idea of FCA assisting us to set up a group, very much as you're talking about. We already have the DC primer course. Make sure people have a chance to take it. Mr. Hache makes a really good point about bringing in some groups that wouldn't traditionally participate in the process, and Ms. Forgey is more than willing to sit and talk with him and others about how to add to that group and create, very much as you discuss, a working group next time. We're very open to that idea, but I do think that education about what we can and can't do is a fundamental starting point, because as I think I said earlier, the biggest surprise to me when I started working on this file was how little room we had for creativity. So I want to give people the opportunity to learn what I've learned along the way.
That education is slow. Are you willing to take that as direction to come back to us with how a working group might work in the process of getting ready for a more comprehensive update of the development charges bylaw?
So Chair, in the conversation I had with Ms. Parry, is that the whole how this gets formed, we talked about, I said we'd start as early as this summer. We'd sit down with FCA, and perhaps FCA can help us put some others at the table. We talk about what that would look like, and I don't mind giving an IPD to council later on what our conversations are. I'd like to work with them to figure out how we construct this. And if council would allow me that liberty to do that, we will report back.
Okay.
All right. So on the motion moved by Vice Chair Tierney, be it resolved that pursuant to Development Charges Act subsection 12(3), Planning Committee recommends council that a further public meeting is not necessary. Is that carried? Okay, and I just would have a reminder that if you have any other, and I'd ask somebody, I don't know whether it would be you, Melody, to reach out to everybody. Next Friday, we would like to have motions, if there's other motions coming in on this. After today's discussion, there might be. So let's get them in so that staff have the time to work on it. Because what was really helpful today is the fact that, for example, the ones you moved for, Councillor Fleury, that Mr. Mark, Mr. Willis, Gary Baker, Ms. Semlick had the opportunity to participate. Otherwise, we are, shooting at fish in a barrel. We don't have that information. Okay? So, is this carries as amended? The development charge? Yeah. Carried as amended? Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Okay, now, we're going to start with our added item, which is Bill 108. And good job, Gary.
How many is that, Gary?
He started in Nepean.
Yep.
He's a Nepean maid. Lives in Barhaven.
How many is that, like 8 bylaws?
Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Gary, how many bylaws is that for you now? 6.
Including Nepean? Say that louder. Put your mic on and say that, please. Anytime you get to say the N-word around here, I'm very, very happy. Thank you.
So Chair, thanks for the opportunity to have a quick verbal update to committee on Bill 108, which was introduced into the Ontario Legislature last Thursday. This is a verbal update that will be followed up by a memo to Council by Mr. Mark in Legal Services to give you further information on this. But given the public interest interrelationship to some of the ongoing projects, we thought it prudent to give you a brief overview today. Bill 108 amends 15 different acts, but Mr. Mark, who, as he's going to present shortly, is going to focus in on the 4 that have the greatest interest to us, the Development Charges Act. And Mr. Binning from Hempson, who's been our consultant on the Development Charges Bylaw, is also here to assist with answering questions related to changes to the Development Charges Act. It affects the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act, the Ontario Heritage Act, and the Planning Act. This is very early days with this new legislation. There's a lot of consultation the province is probably going to do with various organizations, and it has a legislative process at Ontario's legislature at Queen's Park. Much of the information isn't actually in the legislation as we have it today. It will come out when we actually get the draft regulations that go with it. And I always have to understand that the bill may change between first reading and ultimately royal assent and the date of proclamation. So we do not have precise timing on exactly how things are going to roll out, but we thought it prudent to raise some of the issues to you because we are seeking clarification from the province on a number of aspects of the legislation, and should committee have questions or comments today, that might inform the questions we're asking the province, and ultimately, should council wish to make a formal submission on behalf of the City of Ottawa, other than a technical submission that we might do on staff, that would give you the opportunity to do so. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Mr. Willis said, I'm going to be speaking to changes to the Development Charges Act, the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act, the Ontario Heritage Act, and the Planning Act. Dealing with the Development Charges Act, as it was touched on in the presentation on the city's new proposed bylaw, it is proposed that the soft services would no longer be able to be covered through the imposition of development charges. And so these would include parks development, recreational facilities, libraries, corporate studies, which would be the development charge background study, paramedic services, and affordable housing. A second major change in the Development Charges Act is with respect to the timing of the payment of development charges. At this point in the city, development charges are paid at the time the first building permit is obtained in respect to the development. There is an exception for stormwater services in area-specific areas. They are paid by people who don't front-end the service at the time they register the subdivision agreement. Under the proposed legislation, for 5 types of development, the payment would be on a 6-payment basis, the first one being with the earlier of the issuance of the building permit or occupancy, and then on an annual basis thereafter. And those 5 types of development are rental housing, institutional, industrial, commercial, and nonprofit. If a development were to change from being one of these to not one of these, then they would have to pay their full development charges at that time immediately. A third change under the Development Charges Act is the determination of the amount of the development charge. So right now, again, the development charge is, the rate that you pay is determined as of the date that the building permit is issued. So when Mr. Willis showed you that chart, you saw in 2018 that big peak in July of 2018. Why did that happen? It happened because the rates were going up by 6.2% on August 1. And so everybody wanted to get their building permit before August 1. Under the proposed legislation, it will change. And instead, the default will be at the time the development got site plan, at the time the developer applied for site plan approval. So that would be the date that the developers, the rate the developer would have to pay would be determined. If it's not a development that's subject to site plan approval, then it would be the date that the developer applied for a zoning bylaw amendment to permit the development. And if that didn't apply, then you default back to the building permit date. Now, site plan applications and zoning applications can predate a development by a significant amount of time, because it's all dependent on when the developer wishes to move forward with his or her development. The legislation does provide for a default that there would be a maximum amount of time that you'd be able to look back as to determining your rate in advance of the building permit. But that amount of time is not known yet. That is one of the things that will be determined by the regulation. Moving to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act. I'm not aware if there actually been an application that's gone through the whole process under the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act. But what it foresaw was a 2-stage process. And so the first stage would be a hearing completely on a written record, which would look at whether or not what was proposed was consistent with the provincial policy statement and in conformity with the official plan. And then if the tribunal determined that the municipality had acted in a manner contrary to those two, then it would come back to the municipality. It would be entitled to make another decision, and then that decision would be subject to the normal process that people were familiar with in front of the Ontario Municipal Board. This act does away with the 2-stage process. One would simply be going back to having the one hearing that, if any of you have ever seen an Ontario Municipal Board hearing, you'd be familiar with. The Act does, however, make other changes with respect to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act. It permits the tribunal to require mandatory mediation. Right now, a party can just say, I don't want to talk, I don't want to have mediation. As is the case with the courts, where mandatory mediation is required, the tribunal could require it moving forward. It expressly provides that the tribunal may limit examination or cross-examination of a witness. If the tribunal feels that the lawyer has mined the ground sufficiently, the tribunal can tell the lawyer to move on. It continues to provide that case management conferences for official plan, zoning, and certain subdivision appeals would be mandatory under the former OMB process, and there was no hard and fast rule. But if you had a hearing that was likely to last more than 5 days, you would have a pre-hearing conference. This act will continue to require, as did the first LPAT Act, that for any hearing, you'd first have to have a case management conference, bring the parties together, discuss mediation, look at what the issues are before scheduling the hearing. And then finally, it eliminates the ability of the tribunal to refer a matter to divisional court in order to receive the opinion of a court. So right now, the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal can, and the OMB could before it, if there was a difficult legal question, refer it to the divisional court for its opinion before proceeding with the hearing. And the Bill 108 would do away with that. Moving on to the Ontario Heritage Act, the first thing that it changes is respect to the Heritage Register. Right now, the process at the city when properties are sought to be added to the Heritage Register is that staff contact, the consultation that takes place, but when it's going to be coming to committee and council, staff contact the individual owners and telling us to coming to committee and council so that they can show up before council makes a decision whether or not they're added to the register. What Bill 108 foresees is council would make a decision to add them to the register, then we would give notice, and then they could come forward and object. So the city will have to at least consider revisions to its procedures in light of that change. I would expect, but I'll just go through the designation process anyway. I would expect that most members of the committee are familiar with it. There's two types of heritage designations. There's a Part 4 designation for individual buildings, and there's a Part 5 designation for a district. And if the municipality wants to designate a district, then it's always had to go to the OMB or now LPAT if that designation is appealed. However, for Part 4 designations of individual buildings, the process was that the city would make a determination, a bylaw would be adopted if council concurred, and then someone could object. And if they objected, it went to a body called the Conservation Review Board. And the Conservation Review Board would make a recommendation, but it would be council's final say as to whether or not the designation was imposed. The same process was true for a repeal of a Part 4 designation or an alteration to a Part 4 building. The municipality would make a decision. If someone objected, it would go to the Conservation Review Board, but it was a recommendation only. It was not binding on council. The proposed legislation now treats Part 4 buildings similar to the Part 5 process in that an individual can apply, and if council makes a determination, refuses the application, that individual can appeal to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, and the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal can make a binding decision. Another small change to both Part 4 and Part 5 matters, an application has to be submitted and the clock starts, but the 90-day clock that members of the committee will be familiar with, but there's no specificity as to when the clock starts, and so there's some discretion in the municipality to say whether or not an application is complete. The legislation says you have 60 days, and you can always determine that it's complete earlier, but if you haven't issued a statement of completeness by the end of day 60, it's deemed complete, and the 90-day clock starts. With respect to the Planning Act, as you've no doubt heard, it reduces the time frame for OPAs and zoning from 210 and 120 to 150 days and 90 days respectively. What does reducing the time frame mean? It means someone can appeal it and get into a queue for hearings at the local planning appeal tribunal. It does not necessarily get them a decision any faster than they'd otherwise get, but they can get in a queue for a hearing. One other change that is made that will affect some of your community, all of your community members who appear at hearings as participants as opposed to parties. Very briefly, a party is someone who takes a full role, can ask questions, can make submissions, and if they misbehave, can be subject to costs. Participants are someone who in the past were able to show up at a hearing, make their statement, be subject to cross-examination, but that would be their only role. But they were allowed to come forward and make an oral statement. The legislation now provides that they can only make a written statement. There is no opportunity for participants to come forward and give their evidence. It does allow the tribunal to call them to the stand if the tribunal sees fit, but if the tribunal decides it doesn't want to hear from them, there's no opportunity for participants to give oral evidence in front of it. A big change with which I suspect you all have heard is that the Planning Act amendments, together with the Development Charge Act amendments, do away with, as I already mentioned, development charges for soft services. It also does away with Section 37 benefits, so those are amounts or other benefits or services provided to the municipality in return for greater height or density of the development. And it also does away with cash in lieu of parkland. And so one thing I want to meet is, if the city adopts a community benefits bylaw, which I expect will be the case, there is no opportunity on the part of the municipality to get land under site plan approval. There's no opportunity to get cash either, but that's important. And with respect to subdivisions, it also will have a, in my opinion, significant impact. Because if the municipality adopts a community benefits bylaw, and I'll come in a moment to why I expect the municipality will want to, then you cannot take land from a subdivision with respect to parkland. And that is a significant change. And it occurs to me that that's going to provide problems for planning staff and for Mr. Chenier's department. So that's a matter that staff are going to have to turn their minds to. So the community benefits charge includes soft services under the Development Charges Act, Section 37 benefits, and cash in lieu of parkland. And the community benefits charge will be determined as a yet-to-be-defined, thank you very much, Councilor Moffat, will be as a percentage yet to be defined of the value of the land. So that will come in a regulation. How the value of land will be determined will be based on a process where a number of appraisers are involved, and if the appraiser for the city and the appraiser for the developer can agree, then there would be a roster of appraisals who would then come forward with a value. So a very key question will be, what will be the value, what will be the percentage of the value of the land that the municipality is entitled to, and that also will be determined by regulations. And finally, with respect to moving from where we are today to where we would have to be under Bill 108, well, the first thing is it will depend on the final language of the Act, of course. Secondly, it will depend on how much time the province allows to us. And again, that's going to be specified in the regulations, so we don't know. With respect to the financial impact, the treasurer provided to me that the city presently receives about $34 million per year in soft services, cash in lieu of parkland, and Section 37 benefits. So with respect to 2018, that is the amount of monies that are at issue. Finally, Madam Chair, the bill is up on the environmental registry, and the comment period is open until midnight on June the 1st. Thank you very much, committee.
That was great, Mr. Mark. As always, it's a lot to comprehend, and I think that for what we know, I think you've given us all you could. Councillor Leeper has a question. Oh, you were first. Sorry, Councillor Blais was before Councillor Leeper. Anybody else?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I've got a number of questions, so please apologize if they're not well thought out and ordered cohesively. The spreading of the payment of development charges over time, you made some inference to that period of time being determined by regulation. Have they speculated what that would be, or did I mishear that?
I either intentionally or through my voice, I may have been unclear. 5 years, so 6 payments, so starting off with the payment, and then 5 further annual installments.
And we used to use a site planning process within subdivisions. It's been some time, I believe, but there had been agreement, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, builders used to have to get site plan approval for some aspects of subdivision outside the subdivision process.
For multi-story walk-up units, they're subjected to certain types of site plan applications. Certain uses, like single-family houses, are not, but some types of things within subdivision plans are.
Yeah,
and in commercial too.
Okay, this is sorry. I was busy over the weekend, so I didn't really listen to the provincial announcement, but this is pretty bad.
So, Chair, if I may, I mean, trying to offer council some advice at this point. There are a number of matters we're going to seek technical clarifications on at a staff level. There are some significant financial implications to the city with respect to the changes to the Development Charges Act, cash in lieu and the like. There are certain individual little provisions in here. For example, this community benefit clause that has it, council is required to spend that money, 60% of that money within the next year you get it. So, which from our perspective means that you could never do a large project with any of that money. You'd be stuck with very small projects. So I would recommend council, and we're here to help, and I think after Mr. Mark's technical memo comes out, we as staff will make ourselves available should councillors wish to formulate a series of positions from the city that council may wish to take to recommend some changes to the province on the matters that probably have the larger impact to us. And then if councillors wish to make their own comments to the environmental registry outside of the city's process, we can also help you figure out how to do that.
Do you want me to come back to you? Because I
Yeah.
can tell you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Leaper. Oh, before that, can I just say to Councillor Brockington, as our representative at AMO, I'm sure you've got your ear to the ground on what's happening there. Certainly, I've seen some correspondence from some other municipalities, some mayors and that are reaching out saying we've got to all get together. I'll come to you after, Councillor Leaper.
I don't have a question, I just wanted to ask. Okay.
So we really don't have a lot of information right now about that community benefit fund, and that's a critical one to understand. What is our timeline for understanding that better? Do you expect answers in time for us to be able to make meaningful comment to Queen's Park by June 1st?
Chair, we don't know. Like we do believe there may likely to be more information in the seen the draft regulations. I've not yet been contacted by anyone from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to provide a more technical briefing on this.
Awesome.
We just don't have additional information to give you.
With respect to the elimination, if I understand properly, the cash in lieu of parkland changes are going to be accomplished by way of removing our ability to have a parkland dedication bylaw, or any parkland dedication bylaw is going to be considered null and void?
Madam Chair, it's not much of a choice. You can have a cash in lieu of parkland bylaw, but then you can't have a community benefits charge. So you would be giving up all the soft services if you wanted to have a cash in lieu of parkland bylaw.
Right, okay, so it's either parks or, okay. The one question that I do think is urgent is, do we consider that the changes 108, does that affect our current balances in CIL accounts? And I mean, I've been saving for 3 years. I've got $2.6 million in a CIL account to build a new field house. Is that still going to be safe if it takes me another year to build this?
Just checking with the treasurer, we believe so far from what we've read, you're intact. You will be able to have them. You just won't be collecting new money beyond it. Now, on the development charges accounts, though, there will be an implication that any accounts in deficit that are no longer applicable, because some accounts, depending on our spend rate, are in deficit 1 year because we expect to get it back over the life of the bylaw where it's in totality. We will have to adjust to avoid accruing debt, have to rebalance out in some sort of closure to apply the new legislation unless we get new information otherwise. And I'm just asking the treasurer if I've got that right.
Do you think it is fair to characterize the community benefit charge? Is it going to remove the individual councillor's influence in how things are spent? So Section 37 requires councillor occurrence. Parkland, cash in lieu of parkland requires councillor occurrence. Do you have any idea of whether that is going to continue to be the case moving forward?
So, Chair, right now the province sets what we can collect, council sets the how do we spend it rules.
Okay.
So I don't see anything in the legislation that would be different than that, other than that clause I referred to about a time limit, which I would hope we as the city would ask the province to delete that particular line from the bill. Okay. Because it's my professional opinion that that's a choice that should rest with council, not with Queen's Park.
Yep. Agreed. The development permit system. So am I understanding the legislation correctly that it would give the minister the ability to force cities to adopt a DPS in transit-oriented areas?
So further information from what we initially had heard through some media reports and clarified it. Yeah. The province today has the power to do that. Okay. The minister today could impose a minister's zoning order on any place anywhere in Ontario to impose it, and the minister has used that power in very specific instances. What the bill does allow is it allows the minister, through either directly or through a regional government, where regional governments exist, to require a development permit area be established. And the bill only sets that, and the bill says it will be based on criteria that the province will set. It doesn't indicate what those criteria will be. Okay. So we believe, based on the information we had before, provinces signaled very strongly through their policy paper relating to creating more housing that they want municipalities to do what Ottawa's already doing, which is where you're investing billions of dollars in transit to upzone appropriately in the areas of transit stations. We believe the province has signaled indirectly an intent that perhaps this is what they would use that for, but that is not in the legislation, and we're only inferring that based on third-party sources, not directly from the ministry.
The final question, Chair. Are you seeking direction from council or committee with respect to providing written feedback on behalf of the city to Queen's Park?
So, Chair, because this is happening so quickly, because of the June 1st deadline, may I suggest, with committee's indulgence, that if individual councillors have points they wish us to make, to send them to me. Okay. We will collate them and form a draft response, as we did in some of the other pieces earlier, based on questions or comments, and then perhaps bring it back on the 24th meeting, is that correct?
22nd?
23rd meeting, in a consolidated, through an we'll do an IPD document to list what we think the issues that should be raised are. Okay. And that would still give us time to at least get committee's input before the June 1st deadline.
Right. It wouldn't go, I think Councillor Blais is right. So that would not be a council-endorsed document at that point. That would be a planning staff document that goes to Queen's Park as opposed to a council document.
That's correct. However, council is meeting between now and then, and should council receive and adopt any motions, those could also be included.
Okay.
Thank you. Say that last line again, please.
There is a council meeting before June 1st. Should any councillor wish to bring forward...
It's the 22nd.
Yeah, that's right. So should any councillor wish to bring forward a motion outside of the process that I've suggested we can do within the timelines available to us, that could be certainly added in. But I'm trying to make... we as staff are trying to make it as
easy...
Mr.
Willis, with all due respect, okay, then we'll have like a hodgepodge of a mess, okay? We can't do it that way. We have to, I think that we've got to look at, if we have a position that we want to put forward, if we have comments we want to make, that it should, if our best opportunity is to go through planning and have the planning committee vote and have that go forward, is far better than to have something where people are adding an item to, we're not adding an item, notice a motion, you know, suspend the rules, let's vote on this. Well, then there's going to be climb on from everybody all over it. It's got to be organized chaos, right? It has to be organized chaos as opposed to unorganized chaos, which I think it would be.
Yep.
So I would suggest that perhaps what we do, and Andrea Gay has just had some workshops and stuff that she's run on development charges, maybe an opportunity for all members of council to participate. I don't know whether that's manageable or not, but it's going to be a way that, so that we don't get into the argument about, well, I didn't know, and yes, go ahead. What do you, obviously, you must have a recommendation.
Well, I have an idea. Could council not pre-endorse committee's decision, so pre-authorize committee to make the decision on behalf of council
Well,
in some kind of...
Chair, may I build on your idea? Because I think what you just, I'm at committee's direction here. And I'm not challenging what the chair said. Perhaps if we arrange a technical briefing for any councillor who wishes to attend between now and that planning committee meeting so they can feed us questions, we bring that motion to planning committee, council pre-authorizes planning committee to endorse the position, and therefore we would, all councillors would have the opportunity to discuss this with staff so we know any councillor who has an interest. Is that a reasonable
and if it's
compromise?
a technical briefing, you know, then it probably will be the way we do technical briefings. And if the media are there, the media are there. I mean, if that's the way we decide to go. We don't have a lot of time. Our other choices, we could ask for a delay because we don't have the luxury of having enough council meetings to have the opportunity to have a fulsome discussion, or even like a partially fulsome discussion. Ask them for a delay for until the June the whatever council meeting it is. June the, anybody know? John, do you know? John Willing? No? June 1st, the 8th, the 6th, the 13th.
And Chair, there's precedent for that because we have in previous provincial consultations indicated we are going to submit comments, but they will be late, and they did receive them, notwithstanding that they were late.
Yes, but I think that we should formally ask.
And Chair, so I can take committee direction to notify the province that we will submit, but they will be late.
Yeah, because we need to have the opportunity to have a full discussion with all colleagues on council. Yeah, I mean, it's not, and look, a lot of what we're going to put forward is going to be questions, right? A lot of it's going to be, we just don't know. Councillor Blais and then Councillor Brockington.
Yeah, thanks. Just on the notion of this new bylaw that they would allow us to pass, have they put any definition around this? Could it be regionalized? Can it be segregated by type? Or is it a blanket community benefit? You know?
There's no direction of that sort in here, but I would imagine if you read the development charges bylaw as it is, actually that's a good point. We should go back and clarify whether we can have area-specific charges under that.
Yeah, so your choice, though, Madam Chair, as I understand the legend, there's a maximum. And if you wanted, in certain areas, you want to charge less than the maximum, in the abstract, I think you'll probably have the right to do so, but you'll be giving up revenue. You won't be able to balance it off if you say, if there's one area where, for whatever reason, you believe you should pay more, and another area should pay less, you'll be caught by the maximum, so it just will be lost revenue to the city.
And have they indicated how so the maximum will be a dollar value for the city, or will it be based on some kind of square footage or area of the development?
Chair, it's a percentage of the land value.
Of the total land value?
Of the total value. And the province has not specified what that percentage is. It just indicates in the legislation that it's a percentage of the land value.
Sure, but the available land for development in the city today will be the same as tomorrow unless we change the boundary, right? So how do you plan? I guess the point is, how do you plan? You don't know.
Chair, the councillor has got exactly where my head was going on this, which is there is a lot less predictability in this system. I described earlier how imperfect the existing development charges system is for predictability. This new system is further unpredictable, and that is a concern.
You know, I think we need to articulate, and all of us who, you know, we all represent different parts of the city that have different needs and different forms of development, and I don't pretend to speak to areas of the city that are denser than Orleans and Cumberland, but this will really make it impossible to have a community park or a district park, or certainly not one that comes along near the time of completion of the subdivision. And so all the strides we've made to get parks built relatively close to when people move in will have been eliminated. We're going to go back to waiting a decade. You pay a premium to buy a park. By the time the park's built, your kids are in university and you don't want to be beside a park anymore because they're loud and
Basketball.
the benefits to your kids aren't there because they want something else. This is really going to, you know, I'm sure there are consequences in the interurban area too, but in the suburban context, in a subdivision context, this is going to destroy our ability to create complete communities quickly.
Chair, I had the same question from another councillor who is no longer in the room earlier this morning related to another identical situation in another part of the city. My concern is with the provision in the legislation that says we have to spend 60% of the money within 1 year, that would mean we could not use these for large projects that where we normally take 10 years to raise the money.
But also, we need to use this money to buy the land, right? Whereas today, we're given the land through the subdivision process.
Correct.
That's huge. And Millennium Park is a 50-acre park inside the urban area. 50, you know, at 300 grand an acre, you're talking about, you know, 100 million. Anyways, $50 million just for the land. That's insane. Sorry.
Okay, but this isn't the final, right? They're tossing it out. Just like other things that they've done, they've tossed it out. People are providing input, and they're making changes. I fully expect that that's what's going to happen here, too. You know, I just think that we need to do our due diligence, and we're going to have that opportunity because we're going to ask. Are you going to ask for the extension, Mr. Willis?
Chair, this afternoon I will communicate with the ministry and let them know that we will be submitting comments, but they will be late. The last time we didn't frame it as an extension, we just made it
It wasn't
very
a big deal. Yeah.
It was not an issue.
Okay. So finally, I'm going to go to Councillor Brockington. Oh, well, then I'm not going to Councillor Bernard? Heather?
Okay, so my question is about AMO's response to Bill 108 and making sure that we're cooperating with that group and piggybacking on their advocacy on this, because obviously they're doing a lot of work on this. I know Councillor Brockington being the rep on AMO, maybe that's what you were going to raise, but I certainly just wanted to say I know that they're taking action now, and what are we doing to piggyback on that? That may be our best course of action here.
AMO?
To utilize what they're saying.
That's why we're going to Councillor Brockington, because he's our representative. So I would imagine he has the most up-to-date info.
Okay.
So thank you, Madam Chair and Councillor Menard. The Association of Municipalities of Ontario have called an emergency meeting to be held 2 weeks from today on May 23rd, so I will not be able to attend the Planning Committee. Like other municipalities, AMO's staff is struggling to keep up with the pace and the quantity of proposed changes that our current provincial government have been moving forward. With respect to Bill 108, it's basically 6 or 7 days old, so there isn't an AMO statement per se yet, but there are many issues that we're raising in 2 weeks from now. This will be one of them. And I highly suggest that the city do send in comments on this and other matters. AMO will be commenting, but of course, let's not exclusively expect AMO to comment on everything. I think for legislative changes that are being proposed, the more voices they hear, the better. Because that what has swayed some proposals thus far is the sheer volume of pushback from the public, and AMO will be pushing back and providing comments, but certainly the City of Ottawa and others need to speak up as well. So after, and I've mentioned, I've met with the Mayor's office a few days ago. I will be fully briefed on the city's position on other matters, so that when I go to AMO, I can articulate the city's position and concerns on the whole.
But we won't have a position at that point.
No, but there are certainly staff concerns on other proposals that I can be educated on, so that when I go to AMO, I'm aware of, the Ottawa concerns.
So that's great, and that's why I asked you for that, because I figured there was some kind of plan. And we have to remember that the big elephant in the room, Toronto, isn't part of that AMO either. So Mr. Willis, can I just ask you who's sitting beside you?
want to introduce Mr. Craig Banning from Hemson, who is our consultant on development charges, does well over half the development charges bylaws for municipalities in Ontario.
Okay.
I have him here because he like us, have been following the legislative changes. He's been on some calls with the province related to this Ministry of Finance. As I said, he's been providing us some insight to what he's heard so far. But again, there are not a lot of details in all these instances.
Okay, so what I would like to do, because now we know the timing that our representative, Councillor Brockington, is going to Toronto for a meeting specific, I think that we need to have, yes, as you hear issues that are raised from amongst the colleagues, maybe ideas to complement some of the things that they've said, so it's not all negative, and that we arm him as well as we can. And also, if other councillors, we've got to what I want you to do is come up with some kind of a way that we can have councillors collate, if you will, their information through you so that your staff can make comments on it, because we are the largest municipality in AMO, and I would be very interested in what's happening in Toronto, what John Tory and his group are saying as well. Okay? So we don't have a lot of time, and I think that we need to do it through email and that sort of thing.
So Chair, may I, with your indulgence, so my suggestion is if individual councillors have thoughts or questions, you can send them to me directly. We will arrange a technical briefing based on the information we know to date, which would assist any councillors to again formulate their questions. We will do a consolidation and bring that back to Planning Committee. We will notify the province that we will be late because we want council's endorsement of our position. We will provide that information. Anything available by the time Councillor Brockington goes to AMO, I will meet with Councillor Brockington in advance to go over what we have so far. But time is of the essence.
Okay. Okay, is that good? So encapsulate that in some kind of a memo that you send to us for later today or early tomorrow morning that we can move forward on as a group. I doubt it. Do you have any idea when the second reading might be? I think it's... No, I think it's quite far off, actually. Mr. Mark?
The first date of second reading has started, so I know that it was before the legislature for debate on May 8th, but I don't know when it's to conclude.
What did you just say?
Sorry, Madam Chair. The first day of second reading debate has occurred on May 8th. I don't have any information, though, as to what the intent is as to when they hope to have it enacted.
Okay, well, we can make some contacts and find out. All right, so so thank you, that information is received. Any inquiries? Any notice of motion? Any new business? Well, we had lots of new business, so we're adjourned until the 23rd. Yeah. Okay, never boring around here.